Chapter 10:11. In an instant, Su Ming was surrounded by countless waves of tears. Their roars were piercing to the ears, and their voices seemed to be able to pierce through the galaxy as they reverberated in all directions. In fact, there were even some that were 1,000 feet tall among the waves of tears that were pouncing on Su Ming with madness and greed. Idiot! Su Hui's expression changed. Without any hesitation, she shifted to save Su Ming. She knew that with his level of cultivation, he might be able to last for a while, but Dao Kong, who had not gone through too many bloody battles and had not experienced too many life and death situations, was like a flower in a house. He would definitely wither in the cold wind. Besides, she was certain that Su Ming's actions just now had been a moment of recklessness. This did not fit Dao Kong's personality, but when she thought about it, he was just hot-blooded. She might have been angry at his foolishness, but in the depths of her heart, a barely noticeable change had occurred to her towards him. The expressions of the 9 old men also changed drastically. They immediately wanted to shift over, but the Catwoman was even faster than all of them. Almost at the instant Su Ming was surrounded by the waves of tears, she had already executed her full speed and instantly appeared among the waves of tears. "Young master." Once she appeared, the Catwoman spoke anxiously. At the instant she was about to rush out of the encirclement with Su Ming, her voice suddenly came to a halt. She saw Su Ming, but she did not see a hint of panic on his face. He might still be sullen, but he was very calm. He simply allowed the waves of tears to surround him and pounce on him, using their sharp claws to tear at his body, as if they wanted to tear him apart. However, this was not the reason behind the Catwoman's words coming to a halt. The true reason was because she saw the sharp claws of the waves of tears that could tear apart a cultivator's body let out a sound that sounded like it was made of bronze at the instant they touched Su Ming. Shrill screams of pain rang out, and those screams came from the waves of tears that wanted to tear Su Ming to shreds. Their claws shattered at that instant. It was as if the amount of strength they used to tear at Su Ming was the same amount of rebound that broke their sharp claws. It was as if the strength of Su Ming's physical body was a barrier that not even their sharp claws could tear through. In fact, there was even a wave of tears that was 1,000 feet big. As it roared, it closed in on Su Ming. Its body was so huge that Su Ming was like an ant compared to it. That 1,000 feet wave of tears also used its sharp claws to seize Su Ming's body. That huge claw was about the same size as Su Ming's body, and it looked like it wanted to crush him in one go. Only the Catwoman who had rushed into the swarm of waves of tears saw this. No one else could see it. At the instant the Catwoman's pupils shrank, Su Ming lifted his head, and the cold sneer on his lips became even colder. The killing intent in his eyes seemed to have stirred up the galaxy around him, causing the area to instantly become filled with a chilling air. Boom! Su Ming did not dodge. He simply allowed the 1,000 feet wave of tears to strike his body with its claws, but a scene that shocked the Catwoman appeared at that moment. The ferocious expression on the 1,000 feet wave of tears' face froze for a moment. Veins popped up on its face. It had already used its greatest strength, but to its shock, it discovered that this seemingly weak cultivator could not be crushed even after it used its full strength. It was as if it was not grabbing a cultivator, but a freezing stone that could not be damaged in the slightest. What caused its roars to falter was that Su Ming had actually lifted his hand slowly. This was not a simple lifting of his hand. Instead, once his body was seized by the gigantic claw, he slowly lifted his hand. As Su Ming lifted his right hand, the claw that seized his body began to loosen its grip, despite the wave of tears control. It was as if Su Ming's strength had surpassed that of the 1,000 feet wave of tears. When Su Ming pried off the 1,000 feet wave of tears' fingers, he clenched his right hand into a fist and threw a punch at the sharp claw before him. With a bang, the 1,000 feet wave of tears shuddered violently. The madness on its face instantly turned into terror. Its claw immediately shattered in the midst of its fear. As the destruction spread, its right arm, upper body, and even the entire body of the 1,000-feet wave of tears crumbled with a bang as it let out a shrill roar in terror. At the instant its body shattered, a faint blue glow floated out from its scattered body. Almost at the instant Su Ming looked over, he shuddered. A strange light instantly appeared on Su Ming's face. His heart trembled, because at the instant he saw the faint blue light. The black stone fragment that had always been on Su Ming's body and hidden in his soul had not shown any other effects for a long, long time. The seed of life extermination that Akang had mentioned in the past had exuded a wave of heat at that instant. That power spread out from the black stone fragment that had fused with Su Ming's soul. At the same time, it appeared in each of his clone's senses. It turned into a faint suction force, as if it wanted to suck the faint blue light to it. Su Ming was not unfamiliar with this feeling. It was the exact same feeling he had felt many years ago when he was in the land of berserkers and when he was in Dark Mountain when he entered the dimension in the fragment. Su Ming could not help but feel his heart tremble violently. He had opened a few doors to the dimension in the fragment, but it was clear that there were many more that he could not open. Besides, Su Ming still did not have enough medicinal cores to open the door that had stopped him in his tracks in the past. It was not that Su Ming did not have the materials to create them, but as his level of cultivation increased and he experienced more things, the amount of time he had to calm down and create medicinal pills became very little. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. There were things that could cause his black stone to produce a suction force, and even the feeling that would only appear when he entered the dimension in the stone, all of these things had piqued Su Ming's interest. He had a vague feeling that his black stone would go through a huge change because of this swarm of beasts. A brilliant light shone in Su Ming's eyes. However, as the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears died and the faint blue glow appeared, not only did it attract Su Ming's attention, it also made the waves of tears in the area look as if they had gone mad. As they roared, they even gave up on surrounding Su Ming and charged towards the faint blue glow. It was as if the faint blue glow was even more important to them than the attraction of the God Ascension nectar. Perhaps more accurately speaking, this item was more suitable for their race. This scene not only caused Su Ming's pupils to shrink, even the Catwoman instinctively looked over. It was also at this moment that Su Hui and the 9 old men shifted over. At the same time, they saw a wave of tears that was 100 feet tall, being the closest to the faint blue glow among the numerous waves of tears. Its eyes were bloodshot, and it pounced on the glow without care for anything else. Immediately, the glow fused into its body. In an instant, the 100 feet tall wave of tears roared towards the sky. Its body was immediately drenched in blood, and that was the sign of its flesh and blood being torn apart as it swelled up madly. Its roars were filled with pain, and its body was rapidly swelling up before everyone's eyes. In the blink of an eye, it grew to be 1,000 feet tall. From its combat power that was equivalent to those in Earth Cultivation Realm, it became a 1,000 feet tall wave of tears that could fight against cultivators in the initial stage of World Plane Realm. Its eyes were bloodshot, and when it looked towards Su Ming, a monstrous hatred appeared in its eyes. In fact, the sparkle that shone in its eyes made it look somewhat similar to the wave of tears that had died previously. Roar! The 1,000 feet tall wave of tears roared at Su Ming, but did not move forward. Instead, it moved backwards, as if it wanted to flee far away from this place. This is the first time I've seen a legacy like this. When Su Ming saw that the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears wanted to flee, a faint glint appeared in his eyes, and he chased after it in the span of a breath. The other waves of tears around it also spread out at that moment, and charged towards Su Ming and the others with furious roars. It was as if they were already used to what had happened just now, and it had practically become second nature to them. Quite a large number of waves of tears that were below 1,000 feet had died, but none of them had the faint blue glow in their bodies. Only the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears had the glow that made the other waves of tears go mad. Su Ming's pupils shrank slightly, but he did not say anything. Instead, he took a step forward, and in the span of a breath, he appeared beside the fleeing 1,000 feet tall wave of tears. When he lifted his right hand again, killing intent shone in his eyes, and he forced out a little more of the power of the god Ascension nectar in his body. A loud bang reverberated in the air, and the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears immediately turned its head around with a furious roar. Madness appeared on its face, but even if it had inherited the legacy in a strange state, it could not avoid Su Ming's palm strike that contained the god Ascension nectar. In the midst of the booming sounds, the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears shuddered, and its entire body instantly disintegrated under the palm-generated wind. At the instant its body disintegrated, a faint blue speck of light spread out along with it. Before the other waves of tears pounced on it, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. With a single move, he appeared beside the faint blue glow and seized it. A hint of a cold sneer appeared on the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears on the meteor in the distance. Clearly, it believed that the faint blue glow was not something that a cultivator could control, but something that only waves of tears could absorb. In fact, in its memories, there were quite a number of cultivators who had set their sights on the waves of tears' legacy, but without exception, all of them had their bodies and souls destroyed when they absorbed it. That was why the instant Su Ming's right hand touched the glow, the cold sneer on the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears grew stronger. Yet immediately after, a change occurred. The faint blue glow in Su Ming's hand was instantly absorbed into his body, and a focused glint appeared in his eyes. He could clearly sense that the heat spreading out from the black stone fragment was enough to burn his soul. My body hasn't been doing well this month. I'll try to make my body stronger next month. I want to lose weight and lower my blood lipids. This is the last day. Please give me your monthly votes and recommendation votes. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:12. There's an old ballad. There's a lonely old man in the ballad. There is a vast world in the old man's eyes. That is the era when the gods existed. It is the era when all manner of living things fought against each other. It is the law in which the world operates because of one person's will. The indistinct voice swiftly echoed in Su Ming's head. There was an ancient air contained within that voice, and Su Ming had a vague feeling that it was even older than Sui Chenzi's. People worshipped that old man. They used strange items to offer sacrifices to him. They used strange treasures in exchange for the right to be written into the ballad for individuals and even races. Legend has it that all the people and races who were written into the ballad would become immortal along with the existence of the ballad. They would go from being ordinary to becoming glorious. However, over the course of countless years, only 9 lives and 4 races managed to obtain the old man's acknowledgement by offering their strange items, and they were written into his ballad. From then on, these 9 lives and 4 races began their eternal legend. Su Ming's heart roared, and the voice in his head became even more ancient. As it continued echoing in his head, it was as if the entire universe had become still at that instant. Only Su Ming's will was tumbling and boiling in the voice. At that moment, as the voice echoed in his head, a loud bang that shook his humming soul rang out in Su Ming's head. In the midst of it, an indistinct layer of distortions suddenly appeared around him. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a gigantic vortex. As it rotated, it was like a gaping mouth in space that instantly devoured Su Ming and made him disappear from the universe. Su Ming's heart trembled, but he did not panic. This was not the first time he had encountered this sort of experience. This was the process of entering the dimension in the fragment. When the world before his eyes became clear, Su Ming looked around him, and a familiar scene appeared before his eyes. Fog surrounded him, and everything was indistinct. There was a mountain in the distance, and the door to the mountain was open, as if it was waiting for his arrival. Everything was the same as what he had seen before. This was the world in the black fragment. However, this time, Su Ming did not come here on his own accord. Instead, the black fragment had gone through some sort of strange change, causing Su Ming to be sucked in. Almost at the instant, Su Ming cast his gaze towards the mountain, a roar that sounded like it came from the world in the fragments dimension. It sounded like heavy breathing, and as it reverberated in the air, the ground started trembling. At the same time, Su Ming's pupils shrank. He saw 9 bizarre, ferocious beasts with the backs of turtles, the heads of dragons, and the tails of snakes roaring as they descended from the sea of clouds. Every single one of them was tens of thousands of feet tall, and the heavy breathing came from their mouths. There were 9 chains wrapped around their bodies, and as they descended, the 9 chains were pulled taut. It was as if there was something strange in the sea of clouds, and the 9 Xuanwu tortoises wanted to pull that strange thing out. As the roars grew stronger, Su Ming gradually saw a mountain being dragged out of the sea of clouds. Eventually, most of the mountain was dragged out of the sea of clouds, and with a bang, it landed on the ground. The height and vastness of the mountain surpassed that of the first mountain. In fact, when Su Ming compared the 2 mountains, they were like a giant and a child. The gigantic second mountain was several times bigger than the first mountain. There was also a gigantic stone door on it, and there were also a few ancient words on it. A ghastly presence spread out from those words, and it was incredibly strong. At the instant Su Ming saw them, he even felt as if his soul and even his body were about to be corroded by those ancient words. Su Ming's heart trembled as he looked at those words. At the instant he saw them, he naturally understood the meaning behind those words. Nurture, spirit decays. All lives die, and with them, they will decay. However, the word nurture in front made Su Ming slightly uncertain. He could not tell what it meant. At the same time, after the second mountain descended, the chains on the 9 gigantic Xuanwu turtles that had pulled the mountain out of the sea of clouds were slowly disappearing. It seemed like it would not be long before those chains would disappear completely, as if they would regain their freedom. Surprise, excitement, and excitement could not be hidden from the expressions of the 9 Xuanwu turtles. Su Ming's heart was filled with excitement at that moment. He did not expect that there would be a second mountain in the black stone fragment, and that it would appear right before him at this moment. As of then, Su Ming was no longer the child he was in the past. His experiences had caused his will to become incredibly firm, and the hardships he had gone through in his life had caused his mind to become experienced. If there's a second mountain, then there will definitely be a third. And judging by the timing of the second mountain's appearance, it's clear that it was formed after the waves of tears absorbed the faint blue light. This is the key. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He had only opened a few doors to the first mountain in the fragments dimension, and he did not know how many more there were. Besides, he did not have enough medicinal pills on him at the moment, which was why he could not choose to continue walking through the first mountain. The key to the second mountain's appearance is the souls of the waves of tears after they died. The second mountain's name is Decaying Spirit. Then, I should understand what is contained in the second mountain. Su Ming fell into a moment of pensive silence. He cast a glance at the 9 dark turtles, whose chains had mostly disappeared. A glint appeared in his eyes, and without any hesitation, he charged towards the second mountain's door. The fog on the ground was like an ocean. As it tumbled about, Su Ming moved through it. The second mountain might not have seemed far away, but when he truly reached it, there was still some distance between him and it. After a moment, when Su Ming stood at the foot of the second mountain, he lifted his head, and a feeling of shock rose in his heart. Compared to the mountain, Su Ming was like an ant. In fact, even compared to the mountain's door, he was still incredibly insignificant. He sucked in a deep breath, and based on his experience, he lifted his right hand and placed it on the second mountain stone door. Almost at the instant his hand touched the door, booming sounds that shook the sky and earth reverberated in the air. As they continued spreading out, the stone door of the second mountain before Su Ming opened inwardly with loud bangs. Su Ming stood where he was and sensed a gust of cold wind blowing out from the crack on the door. It lifted his long hair and caused his robes to flutter. There seemed to be rather indistinct murmurs in the wind, as if it was telling him about something ancient in the past. Su Ming waited quietly for the mountain door to be completely opened, and a brilliant light shone in his eyes. Before him was a gigantic mountain cave. It was dark inside, and not a hint of light could be seen. There was only the decaying wind that swam past his hair. Su Ming sucked in a deep breath and took a step towards the tunnel. Almost at the instant his foot landed, a dark light appeared around the tunnel. It was the oil lamps lighting up out of nowhere, illuminating the tunnel in the dark light. The ghastly air might have been incredibly thick, but it allowed Su Ming to see his surroundings clearly. At the instant he saw his surroundings clearly, Su Ming's pupils shrank, and his foot came to an abrupt halt. He saw that there were a few totems on the walls around him, and the pictures carved on those totems contained an endless amount of waves of tears. These waves of tears looked as if they were alive, and all of them had ferocious expressions on their faces. They looked as if they were about to rush out of the totems, giving off a powerful visual impact. At the end of the tunnel, Su Ming saw the first stone door in the tunnel of the second mountain. There was a faint blue glow at the center of the stone door at that moment. That glow was flashing, and every single time it did so, an endless amount of faint blue threads would spread out from it, covering the entire mountain door like a spider's web. Su Ming remained silent for a moment before he lifted his foot and walked towards the mountain door at the end of the tunnel. After a moment, when he arrived beside the mountain door, he fell into a moment of pensive silence. Then, based on his past experiences, he lifted his right hand and pushed his palm against the mountain door. At the instant his hand touched the mountain door, Su Ming's long hair danced in the air, and a focused glint appeared in his eyes. In the ancient ballad, the old man closed his eyes in the end. 9 living beings and 4 races became the eternal beings in the ballad. The old man turned into a statue, and the color of the statue was black. He shattered and turned into 13 pieces that disappeared into the world. Before he disappeared, the 9 living beings and 4 races heard 2 words echoing in their minds: the seed of life extermination. This is a cycle of reincarnation. This is a time when the will of the world went from being to non-being, and also from non-being to being. Welcome back, you who possess the blood of the Abyss Builders and the will of a king. The seed of life extermination was reborn because of you. The first spirit you offered was the spirit of the wave of tears. This spirit is flawed. If you find its flaw, you can kill this race. You have an endless amount of time to use the medicinal pills you offered previously to create decaying spirit that can stimulate this spirit's flaw. If you give up, then the first step in nurturing the spirit of life extermination will not be to choose the spirit of the wave of tears. The voice in Su Ming's mind echoed in his head. It sounded as if it had been left behind since ancient times. At that moment, the voice gradually disappeared. At the instant it did so, Su Ming's mind trembled. A huge suction force spread out from the stone door. That suction force was not sucking in Su Ming's body, but his will. The suction force that he could not fight against caused Su Ming to instantly close his eyes. His body was still there, and his hand was still touching the mountain gate, but his soul had been sucked into the stone door at that moment. He was immersed in an ancient era to Su Ming. It was a galaxy without any stars. There was an ancient ship that seemed to have no end. It floated in a broken galaxy, and there was an old man sitting at the bow of the ship. He stared at the galaxy in the distance, quietly, and did not move. Su Ming looked into the distance, and he also saw himself. At that moment, he was that old man. There was a black dot swiftly flying towards him in the galaxy. It was a crane that had an arrogant and vulgar look on its face. Its presence was incredibly strange and ever-changing. It was flapping its wings and flying swiftly towards him. Behind it were hundreds of thousands of waves of tears. They were tied up in a huge net, and the crane was dragging them towards him. "Ha, old man, this time I brought you an offering of most of my race." Requesting for monthly votes to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:13. Once the black stone fragment leveled up, many of Ear Root's ideas will be revealed one by one. The bald crane's origins will also be slowly revealed. Once my body gets better, I will recover and update myself. I will definitely explode. Just like how I am comforting myself right now, everyone's guaranteed monthly tickets will also be given to me. Please give me guaranteed monthly tickets. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:14. Your Grandpa Crane. I won't ask for much. One spot will do. One spot. Even if you want me to call you Grandpa, I'll do it. One spot. With an expectant look on its face, the black crane flapped its wings and arrived in front of the broken ship, right in front of Su Ming. The gigantic net behind it was boundless. There were hundreds of thousands of waves of tears packed densely within it, and none of them were less than 1,000 feet tall. There were quite a number of them that were 10,000 feet tall, and there were even a dozen-something waves of tears that were 100,000 feet tall. What caused Su Ming's heart to tremble was that there was a wave of tears that exuded an old presence among the waves of tears. Its entire body was golden, and it was 400,000-something feet tall. Its eyes were closed, and it did not move. "It's you again, little crane." An ancient voice with a strange tone came out of the mouth of the old man, who was Su Ming's host body in an elegant manner. This was not Su Ming's voice, but the old man's. Su Ming might have felt that he had become the old man, but in truth, it would be more appropriate to describe his current state as a third party, and he was witnessing this scene that had once been silent in the passage of time. He looked at the black crane before him, and he had originally been a little uncertain, but when he heard the black crane's voice and saw its arrogant and vulgar presence, Su Ming was 8/10 certain that the black crane before him was the bald crane from the past. If he were to make deductions based on this, then the time he was in should have been incredibly ancient, 9 living beings for races. A thought appeared in Su Ming's heart. A Kang and the bald crane are all life forms of the same level. Could it be that they are among the 9 lives mentioned in the ballad? This thought caused Su Ming's pupils to shrink. At that moment, the old man's voice suddenly traveled into his ears once again. "Whether or not I can get a spot will depend on whether the offerings you bring me have what I need." The old man shook his head and lifted his right hand to point at the black crane. Immediately, the body of a wave of tears that was 2,000-something feet tall instantly dissipated from the net behind the black crane. It disappeared from the net, and when it reappeared, it was right in front of the old man. As soon as the wave of tears left the net, it let out a piercing howl. Its eyes shone with madness and ferocity. It lifted its right claw and shot toward the old man. The old man's expression remained the same. He only cast an indifferent glance at the incoming wave of tears. With that one glance, the wave of tears suddenly shuddered, and the ferocious glint in its eyes instantly disappeared. At the instant it closed in on the old man, it came to an abrupt stop and lowered its head to worship the old man. Su Ming saw the old man lifting his right hand, or perhaps more accurately speaking, he sensed himself lifting his right hand and pressing it against the top of the wave of tears' skull. With it, a gentle wisp of power surged into the wave of tears' body. Once it swam through the beast's body, it started trembling viciously. It lifted its head swiftly, and its roars shook the sky. Its eyes turned crimson, and its body instantly grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, it was no longer 1,000 feet tall, but a gigantic beast that was 10,000 feet tall. It was as if the gentle power the old man had sent into the wave of tears' body was a strange power that could stimulate the wave of tears' state of being. As that power swam through the beast's body, it caused the wave of tears to erupt with its full power. This shocking scene caused Su Ming's heart to tremble in shock. He did not know just what sort of power would be needed to make a ferocious beast state of being increased by leaps and bounds at that instant. Clearly, this was not the end. Su Ming immediately saw that when the gentle power from the old man's right hand swam through the wave of tears' body a second time, the 10,000 feet tall wave of tears trembled even more furiously. In the blink of an eye, its entire body was drenched in blood. Its flesh and blood grew in a bizarre manner, and its body continued growing larger. Then, with a pained and crazed roar, it grew to 100,000 feet tall from 10,000 feet. The shock in Su Ming's heart was difficult to describe. He stared at the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears. He wanted to see just what sort of changes would happen to it once the old man's power swam through its body a third time. In the span of a breath, that power swam through its body a third time. The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears shuddered. Blood covered its entire body, and its body instantly swelled up. 200,000 feet, 300,000 feet, 400,000 feet. As its body continued growing exponentially, desire and determination appeared on the black crane's face. The waves of tears in the boundless net behind it were all stunned. As they stared at the wave of tears that had now become 700,000-something feet tall, their bodies trembled, and they immediately knelt down to worship it, as if they were going to greet their king. However, almost the instant they knelt down and the wave of tears' body nearly reached 900,000 feet, the wave of tears let out a shrill scream of pain that shook the sky and earth. Its body let out a bang and crumbled, as if it could not withstand the exponential increase in its state of being and had exploded. "How is it, old man? How's the offering this time?" The black crane quickly asked with a nervous expression. "Old man, if it still doesn't work this time, then there's nothing I can do." "How many years has it been? How many offerings have I brought you? It's just a spot. Is there a need for you to be so stingy?" When the bald crane saw that the old man did not speak, it instantly became anxious. "It's still not enough," the old man said faintly after some time. "But this time, you can keep the offering." When the black crane heard the old man's first sentence, its expression instantly became dejected. But when it heard the second sentence, its eyes immediately lit up. It did not think that it would be able to obtain the spot in one go. As long as the old man wanted the offering, then as time passed, it would have the chance to obtain the spot. That was why it beamed with joy. With one move, it immediately turned into a long arc that charged towards the galaxy in the distance, disappearing without a trace in the span of a breath. Once the black crane left, Su Ming looked at the hundreds of thousands of waves of tears in the net before him, and a contemplative look appeared on his face. He did not know what was the goal of the black stone fragment when the second mountain appeared and sucked his soul into this illusion that was clearly something that had existed since ancient times. He could not help but recall the voice that echoed in his head when he touched the mountain gate in the tunnel in the black stone fragment's dimension. "The first spirit you offered is the spirit of the waves of tears. This spirit has a flaw. If you find its flaw, you can kill this race. You have an endless amount of time to use the scattering stones you offered previously to create decaying spirit that can stimulate this spirit's flaw. If you give up, then the first step of nurturing the spirit of life extermination will not be to choose the waves of tears spirit." Su Ming frowned, but at the instant he did so, he was suddenly stunned. He had previously felt that he had become the old man, but in truth, he was only watching from the perspective of a third party. Yet now, as the frown appeared, a thought appeared in Su Ming's heart, and a glint appeared in his eyes. He lifted his right hand, lowered his head, and slowly stood up. In the vast galaxy was a gigantic broken ship. Su Ming cast his gaze forward from the bow of the ship, and all he could see was darkness. After a moment of thought, Su Ming suddenly spoke slowly. "Scattering stones." Almost at the instant Su Ming said those words, the space in front of him distorted, and medicinal cores appeared. They came from all sorts of sects and sects, and they were clearly the items Su Ming had offered to open the mountain gate when he was in the tunnel leading to the first mountain in the fragment's dimension. As he looked at them, Su Ming felt as if he was looking at his past. He saw the memories of the past hidden in the depths of his memories. He sighed softly and focused his mind. He stared at the medicinal pills floating before him, then at the hundreds of thousands of waves of tears trapped in the net. Gradually, he came to an understanding. First of all, this was an illusory dimension. Second, there were medicinal pills before Su Ming, along with the hundreds of thousands of waves of tears. This was the same as preparing test subjects for Su Ming. With the different combinations of these medicinal pills, he could create a decaying spirit core that could specifically target the weaknesses of the waves of tears' lives and wipe out their entire race. The creation of this decaying spirit core requires repeated attempts and a full understanding of the waves of tears. In fact, I have to know these ferocious beast habits, lifestyle, and even the structure of their blood like the back of my hand. Only then can I find a weakness that can target this swarm of beasts and create this decaying spirit core. Forget about whether I can succeed or not. Even if I can create it in the end, I will still need an incredibly long period of time. Based on this, there's a high possibility that the flow of time in this illusory dimension is not the same as that in the world outside. A thought appeared in Su Ming's heart. He immediately looked at the net floating in the space before him. The hundreds of thousands of waves of tears in it had long since stopped roaring. Instead, they remained in various postures, as if they had been frozen. In fact, there's a high possibility that the time in this place has stopped compared to the world outside, because this is something that happened in the past. It does not coexist with the current time. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He was not unfamiliar with this sort of dimension in his life. It did not matter whether it was the Black Stone Fragment, the Candle Dragon's world, or a Kang's world. Su Ming had experienced quite a lot of them. Time in some of these dimensions had slowed down compared to the world outside, and in some of them, it was the same as the world outside. Su Ming had once wondered just what sort of reason had caused these dimensions to be different. However, this sort of thinking was too complicated, and Su Ming could not figure it out. At that moment, he looked at the space around him, and after a moment of silence, a focused glint appeared in his eyes. When he lifted his right hand, he pointed at the hundreds of thousands of waves of tears in the net. Immediately, a spot on the net became indistinct. The wave of tears Su Ming had pointed at disappeared and appeared beside him. It had its eyes wide open and was staring at Su Ming, but like a statue, it did not move. Su Ming stared at the wave of tears before him, then lifted his right hand and pressed it against its body. His divine sense swiftly spread out and fused into the wave of tears' body, and he began observing it in detail bit by bit. He wanted to understand everything about this creature, and from there, he would find the flaw that would destroy its race and create the decaying spirit core for waves of tears. The moment the old man touched the wave of tears, he instantly made the creature's state of being continuously increase. Clearly, during that instant, he gained complete control over the wave of tears' life structure, which is why he could do this. If he could do this to the wave of tears, then the old man should be able to easily do the same to other life forms. He only needed an instant, but I needed an endless amount of time. But our direction is the same. One of these days, I will be able to do the same. Starting from the day after tomorrow, I will resume updating. I beg for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:15. A hint of determination shone in Su Ming's eyes. His life had been full of twists and turns, and he had faced many life and death crises. But after all of them, he had obtained serendipities that surpassed many others. It did not matter whether it was his Akane clone or the changes in the Black Stone Fragment. Either one of them was enough to make a person laugh proudly in the universe. Su Ming had obtained both at the same time, and it could be said to have opened up a wide path for him to walk down the path of cultivation in the future. Su Ming sat down and meditated. Several hours later, he moved his right hand away from the wave of tears in front of him. The wave of tears might not be moving, but the instant Su Ming lifted his right hand, it was immediately reduced to ashes, turning into powder that scattered into the air. Su Ming fell into a moment of pensive silence, then pointed at the net with his right hand. Immediately, another wave of tears appeared before him. Using the same method, Su Ming continued to understand the structure of life within the wave of tears. Time trickled by. As he continued understanding and observing the wave of tears, Su Ming forgot how long he had stayed in this place. He could only vaguely remember that about tens of thousands of waves of tears had been reduced to ashes before him. As he continued observing them, a picture slowly formed in Su Ming's mind. There was a silhouette in that picture, and it looked exactly like a wave of tears. Su Ming closed his eyes. This time, he fell into deep thought for several months. When he opened his eyes again, he had captured another wave of tears. As his eyes sparkled, he drew a line on the wave of tears body with his right hand, and it was instantly cut open. He grabbed its bones and started exploring them bit by bit. He had no idea how much time had passed. When nearly a third of the hundreds of thousands of waves of tears had turned into ashes as he studied them, a complete skeleton appeared in the outline of the wave of tears in Su Ming's mind. This skeleton was the essence bone Su Ming had found after observing tens of thousands of waves of tears. It was a bone that was suitable for all waves of tears. Once it had the outline and the bones, it was followed by the veins and blood vessels. Su Ming calmed his mind and immersed himself in exploring the skeleton. He continuously searched for the distribution of the crystal veins and blood vessels on the waves of tears. He found the slight differences among the tens of thousands of waves of tears, and he also found the similarities. Slowly, the outline of the wave of tears in Su Ming's mind did not just have a skeleton, but also threads intersecting with each other. These threads passed through all the spots on the outline of the wave of tears, forming a rather complete picture of the wave of tears. Once Su Ming finished doing all this, he sensed a hint of ancient air. That ancient air rose in his heart because he had spent an unknown amount of time in the midst of his research. Even though Su Ming had analyzed and judged that time had stopped, his heart was still moving. Because of that, even if time had stopped, he would still feel an ancient air about him. It has the shape, the bones, and the meridians. What it lacks now is flesh and blood. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he once again immersed himself in understanding the flesh and blood of the waves of tears. When there were only half of the waves of tears left in the net, a complete wave of tears appeared in Su Ming's mind. The waves of tears had been reduced to ashes by Su Ming's hands. This beast had form. It had flesh and blood, bones and veins. This picture was the detailed understanding of waves of tears that Su Ming had gathered after he had killed 100,000-something waves of tears over the course of an unknown number of years. In fact, it could be said that Su Ming's current understanding of the waves of tears was even greater than the waves of tears themselves. He understood all the structures of the waves of tears bodies, regardless of whether it was the minute details or the macroscopic details. He also knew their state of life like the back of his hand. Once he destroyed 100,000-something waves of tears, a presence that could not be described had naturally appeared on his body. In fact, it was something that only the waves of tears could sense. This presence was a presence that the waves of tears recognized as their mortal enemy. This presence was the murderous aura that gathered on Su Ming's body after the 100,000-something waves of tears died in his hands. It was also a presence that came from Su Ming's heart after he gained a complete understanding of the waves of tears. At that moment, all the waves of tears in Su Ming's eyes seemed to be able to see through them, no matter how many feet they were. Everything was transparent to him. When Su Ming lifted his right hand and a wave of tears appeared in front of him, he only lifted a finger and gently tapped the spot 3 inches below the wave of tears' chest. With it, the wave of tears shuddered. Su Ming did not lift his finger. Instead, he drew a line downwards and swam through the wave of tears body. He did not use too much of his power, but at the instant he lifted his right hand, the wave of tears fell to the ground. It looked normal, but in truth, all the blood vessels in its body had withered away. This was not due to Su Ming's divine abilities, but due to his understanding of the waves of tears. They were so weak that they could not even withstand a single blow from him. In fact, at that moment, Su Ming only needed to cast a glance at the wave of tears, and he would immediately be able to see its flesh, blood, bones, and veins. It could be said that if Su Ming left this place and appeared in the galaxy outside, then he would be able to face the waves of tears charging towards him in a crazed and greedy manner. He would let them know what it meant to be their natural enemy and what it meant to be terrifying. Su Ming remained silent for a moment before he mumbled softly, "I've spent an unknown amount of time to be able to do this, but at the instant that old man pushed his palm down, he had clearly reached my current state. Only by completely understanding the life structure of the waves of tears could I create the decaying spirit core that could destroy this race of beasts from those medicinal pills." A freezing glare shone in Su Ming's eyes. This dimension was relatively still, which meant that the world outside was still the same as before. The 100,000-something waves of tears were still around. Su Ming wanted to create the decaying spirit core that could be used against the waves of tears. By doing so, he could resolve the crisis caused by the God Ascension Nectar once he left this place. After remaining silent for a moment, Su Ming lifted his right hand and pointed at the floating medicinal pills. All of them immediately floated towards him. Su Ming's eyes burned brightly as he stared at them. After a moment of pensive silence, he brought out dozens of waves of tears from the net with his left hand. He lifted his right hand and swung it. Immediately, the medicinal pills floating in front of him flew into the mouths of a wave of tears. Since this place is an illusion, then besides having a sufficient amount of waves of tears, there must also be an endless amount of medicinal pills. This dimension is just a place for me to search for the method to create the decaying spirit core. The true creation will be in front of the mountain gate in the second mountain's tunnel after I leave this place. Su Ming had experienced far too much in his life, and his mind was already mature. With just a moment's thought, he could understand the reason behind this. Almost at the instant the medicinal pills fell into the mouths of the waves of tears, the air beside Su Ming distorted, and an equal amount of medicinal pills appeared once again. This also verified Su Ming's guess. He did not look at the new medicinal pills. Instead, with a brilliant light shining in his eyes, he stared at the dozen-something waves of tears and observed the changes and differences in each medicinal pill after they ate it. To verify these differences, he recorded every single change in his mind and fused it into the picture of the waves of tears in his mind. Then, he started making deductions again and again. This process was long, but Su Ming was not in the slightest bit anxious. His expression remained the same, and as time passed, he continued trying. From each wave of tears eating one medicinal pill, gradually, each wave of tears swallowed 2, 3, and eventually, one wave of tears swallowed all the medicinal pills. As he experimented and changed, Su Ming's mind was completely immersed in searching for the flaws in the waves of tears. Slowly, the number of waves of tears in the net decreased. In the end, there were less than 2/10 of them left, which meant that there were about 60 to 70,000 of them. As time passed, the number of waves of tears that had died in Su Ming's hands had already reached 200,000. When these medicinal pills are used together, they can produce additional effects. Su Ming lifted his right hand and swung it. A wave of tears with bloodshot eyes and a body that looked like it was about to melt was instantly reduced to powder. This is the 3760 first formula, but can only make a wave of tears' bones melt. It can't kill them instantly. Su Ming shook his head. This was not the decaying spirit pill he wanted. I might not know what the effects of the decaying spirit pill that can truly destroy an entire race are, but in my heart, there is a medicinal pill that can only be called the destruction of an entire race when it explodes. Nostalgia appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He remembered the blood core he had created when he was still a child. It was a medicinal pill that would melt a person the moment they touched blood, and it was incredibly domineering. If their bodies exploded after they melted, then all the waves of tears that came into contact with their blood would melt as well. If they exploded again, then this is the decaying spirit pill that suits my intentions, Su Ming mumbled, and a hint of ruthlessness shone in his eyes. Time passed, and the ratio of medicinal pills continued. It did not matter whether it was one pill, half a pill, or even just a little bit. No matter what, Su Ming used all sorts of ratios he could think of to make these medicinal pills. The number of waves of tears went from 60 to 70,000 to 30 to 40,000, and in the end, there were only a few thousands left. The 78,645th ratio is still too gentle. The 81,324th ratio is still not enough. When there were less than a few hundred waves of tears left in the net, Su Ming's body suddenly shuddered. The 10,000 feet tall waves of tears in front of him instantly turned completely red due to the medicinal core he had concocted this time. In an instant, the waves of tears crumbled and blood gushed out in all directions. A focused glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. When he recalled the ratio of medicinal pills he had made previously, a brilliant light slowly shone in his eyes. This is a change in the blood of a wave of tears that does not fuse with the structure of life in the waves of tears when different medicinal pills fuse into it. This sort of abnormal blood will fuse into the body once it is touched, and it will melt and devour the body. I will also need to add in the power of self-destruction, but this power will require different levels of cultivation from different waves of tears. The higher the level of cultivation, the greater the power of self-destruction. A smile appeared at the corners of Su Ming's lips, and he swiftly stood up. This pill is known as the core of waves of tears. If you like this work, please come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:16. At the instant Su Ming got up, fine cracks immediately appeared in the still illusory dimension. As cracking sounds echoed in the air, the world around Su Ming shattered like a mirror. Su Ming's body was also torn to pieces until he was reduced to shards that disappeared into the vast space. Almost at the instant Su Ming's body disappeared, Su Ming, who had his right hand pressed against the stone door in the tunnel leading to the second mountain in the dimension of the black stone fragment, shuddered violently. He opened his eyes and sucked in a deep breath, as if his soul had returned to his body. His expression changed swiftly, and his right hand, which was pressed against the stone door, started trembling uncontrollably. In fact, he could sense that his soul and his body were not in sync with each other at that moment, giving him an incredibly unfamiliar feeling. A small part of this feeling came from his body, but a larger part of it came from the flow of time. The illusory dimension might be different from this place, but Su Ming was at the point where they intersected. He had returned from the still dimension, and it was only natural that he would feel a strong sense of discomfort. Su Ming lowered his head and looked at his right hand. He saw that it was trembling. In silence, his emotions gradually calmed down, and a brilliant light shone briefly in his eyes. I wonder how many years I've spent in the illusory dimension. It might be still, but the accumulation of time, and there is still an ancient air about it. I've finally created the core of waves of tears out of the 80,000-something medicinal formulas for waves of tears. Su Ming sucked in a deep breath. His gaze landed on the stone door, and with a flash, he took a step forward. He lifted his right hand and pressed against the stone door once again. Almost at the instant his right hand touched the stone door, it let out a loud rumble. The threads of light that were spreading outwards from the light blue glowing spot, like a spider's web, swiftly shrank at that instant. When they shrank to a single point, they turned into a light blue vortex. At the same time, medicinal pills flew out from the vortex and floated in front of Su Ming. These medicinal pills were the ones Su Ming had offered a long time ago. They were also the medicinal pills he had used to experiment in the illusory dimension, and there was an endless amount of them. However, it was clear that the medicinal pills that appeared this time were no longer endless. There were only these. However, to Su Ming, even if there was no longer an endless supply of medicinal pills, it did not matter. He had already found the perfect ratio, and he could successfully create the pill in one go. Su Ming swept his gaze past the medicinal pills, then lifted his right hand and swung it in the air. Immediately, he brought out a medicinal pill, crushed it, and only took out its skin. Then he brought out another medicinal pill, crushed it, and took out 3 portions. He did all sorts of complicated things like this, And in the end, Su Ming created a core of waves of tears in a very familiar manner after an hour in the flames that had appeared out of thin air in his right hand. This pill was as red as blood and looked shocking. It was as if it was not a pill, but a ball of blood. Waves of evil aura spread from this pill of waves of tears, and there was also a thick, sweet smell that spread in all directions. If one smelled this fragrance, one would definitely be intoxicated, but if one smelled it a few more times, it would turn into an uncontrollable urge to vomit, as if one wanted to vomit out all of one's internal organs. Waves of tears, I have returned. A hint of killing intent appeared in Su Ming's eyes. With a single move, he turned into a long arc and left the tunnel. He left the second mountain and the dimension in the fragment. Beyond the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean was a galaxy that would occasionally shine with brilliant galaxies. Roars that sounded like those of babies rose and fell, reverberating in all directions. If anyone could see this place from a bird's eye view, they would be able to clearly see that there were 100,000-something waves of tears there. There was madness on their faces, along with greed and bloodlust. There were 13 warships that were surrounded by the 100,000-something waves of tears. As they roared and howled in madness, the waves of tears launched attacks against the 13 warships again and again. The ones blocking them were thousands of cultivators. All of them looked exhausted and had injuries of varying degrees on their bodies, but they did not retreat. Instead, they gritted their teeth and persevered. Even if their cultivation bases were about to be completely drained, even if their enchanted treasures had shattered, and even if there was no hope left. But they were still there. The 9 old frail darknesses, the 9 old men who originally had their eyes closed, opened them at that moment. White light spread out from their eyes, and the 9 old men's power had clearly reached the later stage of World Plane Realm. They surrounded the 13 warships in 9 different directions and used all their strength to resist the attacks from the waves of tears. If the 9 of them were not around, the waves of tears would have pounced on them a long time ago and submerged all the cultivators on the 13 warships. Yet even so, under the repeated attacks from the waves of tears, cultivators continued dying. Their bodies were torn apart by the waves of tears, and right before all the cultivators' eyes, they were bitten to pieces, devoured, and torn apart for food. The bloody scene brought with it a wave of shock, along with a hint of despair. The Catwoman's speed had already reached its peak. With her speed, she circled the 13 warships and neutralized the dangers they faced time and time again. She also used her slaughter to loosen the pressure. She protected the warships time and time again, causing pillars of light that could destroy everything to erupt from them. But every single time those pillars of light shot out, they could only destroy the fog around the waves of tears. They could not harm their bodies. After all, there were simply too many waves of tears. 100,000 something might not seem like a great number, but if anyone really saw them, they would find that there was no end to them. In the distance were 2 waves of tears that were 10,000 feet tall. As they roared, fog that surged into the sky spread out from their bodies. That fog was like a wave that had corporeal form, and it crashed in all directions. And right before them was Su Hui, who had 17 figures. Su Hui's face was pale. With her level of cultivation, it was very difficult for her to fight against 2 powerful existences who were equivalent to those in Lunar Culpa Realm at the same time. Even if the waves of tears were ferocious beasts and most of their divine abilities could not compare to cultivators, the pressure brought to her by 2 waves of tears that were 10,000 feet tall was still incredibly great. She was at a complete disadvantage, and there were even a few times where she was in danger. Even if she was barely holding on, she would not be able to last for long. More importantly, in the distance was the gigantic meteor floating in the galaxy. The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears was sitting there in a lackadaisical manner. Its gaze was cold, and with scorn as well as derision, it swept its gaze past Su Hui and all the cultivators. There were also 2 waves of tears that were 10,000 feet tall by its side. If they attacked as well, then it would be absolutely difficult for Su Hui to fight against them. Su Hui's face was pale, and anger rose in her heart. That anger was not directed towards the waves of tears, but towards Su Ming, who was Dao Kong. Her impression of Su Ming had changed slightly when he chose to stay and even took the initiative to attack, but she did not expect that all of this was fake. Dao Kong's personality had not changed in the slightest. He was still that mean, unjust, hypocritical, and cunning person. On the surface, he spoke in an upright manner, but in truth, when he rushed out, he had used some unknown method to vanish. She might not be able to sense the ripples of power from relocation, but there was no other explanation for Dao Kong's disappearance besides him being relocated. Besides anger, Su Hui also felt sadness and disappointment. She knew that her fate was already linked to Dao Kong's, and it could not be undone. She was bound to become his wife for dual cultivation. She had tried to change it before, but to no avail. She had also wanted to change Dao Kong before, but to no avail. Right then, when she saw that Dao Kong had fled alone, the disappointment in her heart caused a hint of anguish and desolation to appear on her pale face. Compared to her anguish, the cultivators on the 13 warships surrounded were all silent. They did not roar, and neither did they laugh bitterly. Instead, in silence, they fought against the waves of tears with their lives on the line. As for the 9 old frail darknesses, no one knew what was going on in their hearts. However, based on their occasional glances at the spot where Su Ming had disappeared, it could be seen that they were either disappointed or filled with complicated emotions. The 9 of them were already incredibly tired. The continuous fighting had caused them to not be injured, but the depletion of their cultivation bases, the torment of their wills, the intimidation from the 100,000 feet wave of tears in the distance, and most importantly, the despair of having no hope could turn into the most poisonous poison that could kill everyone's wills. About an hour had passed since Su Ming disappeared. During that hour, the intensity of the battle had surpassed what it had been previously and reached its peak. If there was no external force joining in, perhaps they could still persevere. However, the 100,000 feet wave of tears in the distance seemed to have mocked them enough. It lifted its right hand and swung its arm. Immediately, the 2 10,000 feet waves of tears beside it lifted their heads and laughed ferociously while letting out roars that shook the sky and earth. They turned into 2 long arcs and charged towards the 13 warships. Their arrival would put an end to this hunt. A hint of calmness appeared in the white eyes of the 9 old frail darknesses. It was the calmness of someone who had seen through all life and death before death. The Catwoman shuddered. As she smiled wryly, she was already prepared to die. Instead of living like this, it would be better for her to die. However, she would never have the chance to make up for the regret in her heart. Fellow Taoist Su, we will burn our souls and self-destruct later. We will use this chance to open up a path for you to escape. At that time, you must leave quickly. The 9 old frail darknesses' voices echoed in Su Hui's mind. It won't just be the 9 of us. All the cultivators from Morning Dao sect and the 13 warships will self-destruct. This will cause us to die together, and we should be able to let you leave. Find the young master. Don't blame him. He's still a child. He still needs experience and growth. The 9 of us wish you all the best. From now on, we will hand the young master over to you, fellow Taoist Su. He's a little willful, so I hope that you will be more tolerant. Find him and bring him back to Morning Dao sect. Su Hui's heart trembled. The 9 old frail darknesses had always ignored her, and she had always looked down on these 9 cultivators who were like old slaves. They had practically never spoken to each other, but now, these 9 people were determined to die together with her so that she could have a chance to escape. The 2 10,000 feet waves of tears closed in on her at that moment. Their mighty pressure descended with a bang. Just as the 9 old men were about to self-destruct, the 13 warships were about to self-destruct, and all the cultivators were about to do their best to die together with the waves of tears. Suddenly, at the spot where Su Ming had disappeared was a piercing white light that surged into the sky. It appeared out of nowhere and instantly attracted all the cultivators' attention. It also attracted all the waves of tears' attention. It attracted Su Hui's gaze, the 9 old men's gazes, and even the 4 10,000 feet waves of tears in surprise. The 100,000 feet wave of tears focused its gaze. Then he brought out another medicinal pill, crushed it, and took out 3 portions. He did all sorts of complicated things like this. In the end, Su Ming created a core of waves of tears in a very familiar manner after an hour in the flames that had appeared out of nowhere in his right hand. This pill was as red as blood and looked shocking. It was as if it was not a pill, but a ball of blood. Waves of evil aura spread from this pill of waves of tears, and there was also a thick, sweet smell that spread in all directions. If one smelled this fragrance, one would definitely be intoxicated, but if one smelled it a few more times, it would turn into an uncontrollable urge to vomit, as if one wanted to vomit out all of one's internal organs. Waves of tears, I have returned. A hint of killing intent appeared in Su Ming's eyes. With one move, he turned into a long arc and left the tunnel. He left the second mountain and the dimension in the fragment. Beyond the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean was a galaxy that would occasionally shine with brilliant galaxies. Roars that sounded like those of babies rose and fell, echoing in all directions. If anyone could see this place from a bird's eye view, they would be able to see that there were 100,000-something waves of tears there. They were 100 feet, 1,000 feet, and even 10,000-something feet tall. There was madness on their faces, along with greed and bloodlust. There were 13 warships that were surrounded by the 100,000-something waves of tears. As they roared and howled in madness, the waves of tears launched attacks against the 13 warships again and again. The ones blocking them were thousands of cultivators. These cultivators looked exhausted and had injuries of varying degrees on their bodies, but they did not retreat. Instead, they gritted their teeth and persevered. Even if their cultivation bases were about to be completely drained, even if their enchanted treasures had shattered, even if there was no hope left. But they were still there. The 9 old frail darknesses, the 9 old men who originally had their eyes closed, opened them at that moment. White light spread out from their eyes, and the 9 old men's power had clearly reached the later stage of World Plane Realm. They surrounded the 13 warships in 9 different directions and used all their strength to resist the attacks from the waves of tears. If the 9 of them were not around, the waves of tears would have pounced on them a long time ago and submerged all the cultivators on the 13 warships. Yet even so, under the repeated attacks from the waves of tears, cultivators continued dying. Their bodies were torn apart by the waves of tears, and right before all the cultivators' eyes, they were bitten to pieces, devoured, and torn apart for food. The bloody scene brought with it a wave of shock, as well as a hint of despair. The Catwoman's speed had already reached its peak. With her speed, she circled the 13 warships and neutralized the dangers they faced time and time again. With her slaughter, she released the mighty pressure. She protected the warships time and time again, causing pillars of light that could destroy everything to erupt from them. But every single time those pillars of light shot out, they could only destroy the fog around the waves of tears. They could not harm their bodies. After all, there were simply too many waves of tears. 100,000-something might not seem like a great number, but if anyone really saw them, they would find that there was no end to them. In the distance were 2 waves of tears that were 80,000 feet tall. As they roared, fog that surged into the sky spread out from their bodies. That fog was like a wave that had corporeal form, and it crashed in all directions. And right before them was Su Hui, who had 17 figures. Su Hui's face was pale. With her level of cultivation, it was very difficult for her to fight against 2 powerful existences who were equivalent to those in Lunar Culpa Realm at the same time. Even if the waves of tears were ferocious beasts and most of their divine abilities could not compare to cultivators, the pressure brought to her by 2 waves of tears that were 10,000 feet tall was still incredibly great. She was at a complete disadvantage, and there were even a few times where she was in danger. Even if she was barely holding on, she would not be able to last for long. More importantly, In the distance was the gigantic meteor floating in the galaxy. The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears was sitting there in a lackadaisical manner. Its gaze was cold, and with scorn and derision, it swept its gaze past Su Hui and all the cultivators. There were still 2 waves of tears that were 80,000 feet tall by its side. If they attacked as well, then it would be absolutely difficult for Su Hui to fight against them. Su Hui's face was pale, and anger rose in her heart. That anger was not directed towards the waves of tears, but towards Su Ming, who was also Dao Kong. Her impression of Su Ming had unknowingly changed slightly when he chose to stay and even took the initiative to attack, but she did not expect that all of this was fake. Dao Kong's personality had not changed in the slightest. He was still that mean, unjust, hypocritical, and cunning person. On the surface, he spoke in an upright manner, but in truth, when he rushed out, he had used some unknown method to vanish. She might not be able to sense the ripples of power from relocation, but there was no other explanation for Dao Kong's disappearance besides him being relocated. Besides anger, Su Hui also felt sadness and disappointment. She knew that her fate was already linked to Dao Kong's, and it could not be undone. She was destined to become his wife for dual cultivation. She had tried to change it before, but she could not succeed. She had also wanted to change Dao Kong, but she had still failed. Right then, when she saw Dao Kong fleeing alone, the disappointment in her heart caused a hint of anguish and desolation to appear on her pale face. Compared to her anguish, the cultivators on the 13 warships surrounded were all silent. They did not roar, and neither did they laugh bitterly. Instead, in silence, they fought against the waves of tears with their lives on the line. As for the 9 old frail darknesses, no one knew what was going on in their hearts. However, based on their occasional glances at the spot where Su Ming had disappeared, it could be seen that they were either disappointed or filled with complicated emotions. The 9 old frail darknesses were already incredibly tired. They might not have been injured, but the depletion of their cultivation bases, the torture to their wills, the intimidation from the 100,000 feet wave of tears in the distance, and most importantly, the despair of not having any hope could turn into the most poisonous poison that could kill everyone's wills. About an hour had passed since Su Ming disappeared. During this 1 hour, the intensity of the battle had surpassed what it had been previously, and it had reached its peak. If there was no external force joining in, perhaps they could still persevere. However, the 100,000 feet wave of tears in the distance seemed to have mocked them enough. It lifted its right hand and swung its arm. Immediately, the 2 10,000 feet waves of tears beside it lifted their heads and laughed ferociously while letting out roars that shook the sky and earth. They turned into 2 long arcs and charged towards the 13 warships. Their arrival would put an end to this hunt. A hint of calmness appeared in the white eyes of the 9 old frail darknesses. It was the calmness of someone who had seen through all life and death before death. The Catwoman shuddered. As she smiled wryly, she was already prepared to die. Instead of living like this, it would be better for her to die. However, she would never have the chance to make up for the regret in her heart. Fellow Taoist Su, we will burn our souls and self-destruct later. We will use this chance to open up a path for you to escape. At that time, you must leave quickly. The 9 old frail darknesses' voices echoed in Su Hui's mind. It won't just be the 9 of us. All the cultivators from Morning Dao sect and the 13 warships will self-destruct. This will cause us to die together, and we should be able to let you leave. Find a young master. Don't blame him. He's still a child. He still needs experience and growth. The 9 of us wish you all the best. From now on, we will hand the young master over to you, fellow Taoist Su. He's a little willful, so I hope that you will be more tolerant. Find him and bring him back to Morning Dao sect. Su Hui's heart trembled. The 9 old frail darknesses had always ignored her, and she had always looked down on these 9 cultivators who were like old slaves. They had practically never talked to each other, but right then, these 9 people were determined to die together with her so that she could have a chance to escape. 2 waves of tears that were 10,000 feet tall swiftly closed in on them at that moment. Their mighty presences descended with a loud bang. Just as the 9 old men were about to choose to self-destruct, the 13 warships were about to self-destruct, and all the cultivators were about to do their best to perish together with the waves of tears. Suddenly, at the spot where Su Ming had disappeared was a piercing white light that surged into the sky. It appeared out of nowhere and instantly attracted all the cultivators' attention, as well as all the waves of tears. It attracted Su Hui's attention, attracted the 9 old men's attention, and even attracted the surprise of the 4 10,000-foot tall waves of tears. The 10,000-foot tall wave of tears narrowed its eyes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:18. This is... The 9 old frail darknesses were momentarily stunned, but they immediately saw that the spot where the white light had come from was the spot where their young master had disappeared. They might have thought that it was impossible, but they could not help but form a guess in their hearts. The Catwoman's pupils shrank as she stared at the spot. Su Hui was also momentarily stunned. She frowned. She did not believe that Su Ming had returned. In her eyes, Dao Kong had already fled an unknown distance away. However, what happened next caused the hearts of all the cultivators in the area to tremble. This was because when the 100,000 waves of tears that surrounded them saw the white light, the madness and savagery on their faces instantly disappeared and were replaced by terror. Their bodies trembled, and even though their roars were still echoing in the air, the feeling they gave off was no longer that of savagery, but rather mournful wails. Those were the wails of the 100,000-something waves of tears. As they trembled, they swiftly spread out in all directions, as if the spot where the piercing white light came from was an indescribably terrifying existence to them. It was the same for the 100,000-something waves of tears, and it was the same for the 1,000-something waves of tears. In fact, even the 410,000-something waves of tears started trembling at that instant. Disbelief appeared on their faces. Roar. A roar shook the sky and earth, and shook the entire galaxy. In fact, the hearts of all the cultivators, including Su Hui and the 9 old frail darknesses, trembled, and their minds instantly went blank. A roar that shook the heavens came from the mouth of the 100,000 feet waves of tears king on the meteor in the distance. This was the first time it had ever let out a roar, and as it did, it rose up from the asteroid. It was 30,000 meters tall, making it look like an undefeatable god. It was enough to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who saw it. Yet at that moment, a grave expression that had never appeared before appeared on its face. The more than 100,000 waves of tears in the surroundings forcefully stopped their dispersing footsteps under the roar of their king. Their bodies trembled as they stood in the starry sky and stared at the increasingly blinding white light. This scene stunned Su Hui, the 9 old frail darknesses, and all the cultivators. While they were surprised, a bad feeling rose in their hearts. The 9 old frail darknesses' previous guess that the white light was Su Ming disappeared at that moment. Their guess was that a ferocious beast that was even stronger than the waves of tears was coming from within the white light. A sense of bitterness rose in everyone's heart. It was at this moment that an illusory figure gradually appeared within the growing white light. The silhouette of the illusory figure was not that of a beast, but a human. As the silhouette appeared, anguished wails immediately rose from all directions. Those were the cries of the more than 100,000 waves of tears, and they were unable to control their terror. The ones that were 1,000 feet tall were in a better state, but some of the ones that were 30 feet tall were even howling in pain, as if they had gone mad and began to flee. In an instant, the entire horde of waves of tears in the galaxy was thrown into chaos. Roar! The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears roared again, causing the fleeing waves of tears to pause for a moment. But at that moment, a cold harumph came from the illusory figure of the white light. The cold harumph reverberated in the air. It was nothing to the cultivator's ears, but when it landed in the waves of tears' ears, it was like thunder rumbling in the sky. The 100 feet tall waves of tears let out shrill cries, and without any hesitation, they scattered in all directions without a care for the will sent to them by their king. It was also at that moment that the figure in the white light walked out completely. He was dressed in a sacred constellation robe, and his long hair spilled over his shoulders. He had a handsome face, a slender body, and a cold, piercing smile on his lips, causing a thick, malicious air to spread out from him. "Young master, it's the young master. The young master has returned. Greetings, young master." At the instant Su Ming appeared, the cultivators on the 13 warships were momentarily stunned before their spirits rose. It was as if all their fatigue had been swept away at that instant. As voices of worship reverberated in the air, the 9 old frail darknesses cast deep glances at Su Ming, wrapped their fists in their palms, and bowed to him. They did not ask why Su Ming had returned, but when they saw their young master again in this place, they could not help but feel respect for him in their hearts. As for the Catwoman, she was completely taken aback, just like Su Hui. Never in her wildest dreams could she have imagined that Meng Hao would return. "I told you I won't leave. Even if I leave, I will take all of you with me," Su Ming said calmly, then turned his head around to cast a glance at the 100,000-something waves of tears that were howling in pain and in chaos. The cultivators could not sense the mighty pressure contained in his gaze, but when the 100,000-something waves of tears saw Su Ming and his gaze swept past them, their howls became even louder, and they scattered even faster. It was as if Su Ming's existence was the source of their terror, as if he was the source of their endless terror. The cultivators from Morning Dao sect did not understand all of this, but Su Ming knew the reason behind it. He had killed hundreds of thousands of waves of tears. Naturally, there was an aura on his body that only the waves of tears could sense. This aura was a murderous aura that caused the waves of tears to tremble. Su Ming's gaze could make the waves of tears even more terrified because all the waves of tears he looked at would have the misconception that their bodies were being dismembered in their low intelligence. It was as if all the structures of their bodies, the amount of flesh and blood, the distribution of their skeletons, and the number of their tendons, had turned transparent at the instant Su Ming looked at them. In fact, they would even have the misconception that the places Su Ming looked at were the places where they had been injured or the weakest parts of their bodies. This feeling, in addition to the monstrous murderous aura and the invisible pressure, became the reason why they collapsed. It was just like how in a mortal world, if a dog butcher could kill hundreds of dogs in his life, then he would possess a murderous aura that could make even dogs tremble when they ran into him. It was just like killing people. If a person could personally kill thousands of people, then the killing intent gathered on him would be easily detected by a mortal with just one gaze. This was due to his intelligence. If he killed hundreds of thousands of people, then that feeling would become even stronger. Waves of tears were ferocious beasts with incredibly high intelligence, and they would naturally be able to sense it even more clearly. This scene surpassed all the cultivators in Morning Dao sect's expectations. It also caused Su Hui to suck in a sharp breath. When she looked at Su Ming, her gaze was filled with an unfathomable feeling. She did not know just what Su Ming had gone through after he disappeared. Why was he able to cause chaos in the waves of tears just by standing there when he returned? The 9 old frail darknesses were also puzzled. At that moment, a roar that shook the galaxy traveled forth for the 3rd time. It came from the 100,000 feet waves of Tears King. It stood on the meteor and roared at Su Ming. Its expression was solemn, and a brilliant light shone in its eyes. Its roar was like a wave of sound that swept in all directions. It was a challenge given by the waves of Tears King. As he roared, the waves of tears that were 100 feet tall shuddered. They might still be retreating, but the waves of tears that were 1,000 feet or even 10,000 feet tall gritted their teeth and forced down the presence that made them tremble from Su Ming's body, and they no longer retreated. Instead, they gradually approached him. As for the 4 waves of tears that were 80,000 feet tall, their eyes turned bloodshot. As they roared, they charged towards Su Ming. In an instant, thousands of waves of tears rushed towards Su Ming, and not a single one of them was less than 1,000 feet tall. Su Ming smiled coldly. Almost at the instant the waves of tears closed in on him, he took a step forward. The Duke of Crimson Flame shifted, and in an instant, Su Ming disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already beside a wave of tears that was 1,000 feet tall. The 1,000 feet tall wave of tears shuddered, but before it could do anything, Su Ming lifted his right hand and pointed at its chest in a familiar motion. Then, like moving clouds and flowing water, he drew a long line with his finger on the wave of tears body. In the blink of an eye, it circled the creature's body once. Then, without even sparing a glance, he walked towards another wave of tears. Behind him, the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears shuddered. When it lowered its head, blood trickled out of the corners of its mouth, and its body went limp. The spot where Su Ming's finger had touched was an old wound it had sustained when it fought in the past. The long line that had drawn a circle had sealed off one of its tendons, causing its blood flow to come to a halt. At the same time, it stimulated the injury it had suffered in the past. In an instant, its heart stopped beating, and its body fell to the ground. It died just like that. This scene caused the pupils of all those who saw it to shrink. 1, 2, 3. Su Ming moved about, and wherever he went, the waves of tears that were 1,000 feet tall would not be able to fight back. In fact, Su Ming did not even use too much of his cultivation base on them. He understood the waves of tears' body structure far too well. With just one look, he could already tell where a creature's life force was. As Su Ming moved forward, more waves of tears died. As their roars grew louder, the 10,000 feet tall waves of tears also roared and charged towards him. The number of waves of tears surrounding Su Ming gradually increased from the thousands. Still not enough. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He wanted the waves of tears to be denser, so he charged towards the 100 feet tall waves of tears. At that moment, the 100,000 feet tall waves of tears king let out a fourth roar and reverberated in the air. The will contained in that roar caused the 100 feet tall waves of tears to tremble and descend into madness, as if they had been forced into a corner. They no longer retreated, but instead charged towards Su Ming while roaring. Su Ming might have seemed to be in danger and surrounded, but all of this was exactly what he needed. The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears roars had helped him out greatly. In fact, the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears left the meteor for the first time as it roared. Its gigantic body took a step forward in the galaxy and appeared around Su Ming, joining the swarm of waves of tears. Clearly, Su Ming's return had not only terrified the normal waves of tears, but also made the waves of tears king feel a mighty pressure. The waves of tears' great combat power that was equivalent to that of an old monster in Solar Culpa realm caused the galaxy to roar at the instant it appeared. Ripples spread out, and a supreme power descended swiftly, intending to crush Su Ming. Su Ming smiled. He turned around and looked at the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears. When it arrived, he lifted his left hand and seized the air to his left. Immediately, a 1,000 feet tall wave of tears was seized by its throat. Su Ming might have been very small compared to it, but this did not stop him from moving. With it, the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears instinctively opened its mouth. Su Ming's smile was cold and sinister. He swung his right hand, and medicinal core appeared in his hand. He pushed it into the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears mouth. This was the core of waves of tears, which Su Ming had prepared for countless years, tried 80,000 something formulas, and experimented with hundreds of thousands of waves of tears. I was discharged early. After being treated for the past few days, my head was no longer as dizzy. I was prescribed some medicine specifically for dizziness, and when I felt dizzy, I would take it, and I would be fine. I did not intend to continue receiving the drip. I also asked the doctor, and he suggested that I stay in the hospital for another month. But even if I were to receive treatment, I would only be able to recover my tinnitus and my hearing. If I don't recover, I will have tinnitus for the rest of my life. I've thought it through and decided not to treat it. I'm fat, and my blood cholesterol is high. My blood is thick, and my transaminase is high as well. I intend to eat vegetables and tofu every day and exercise every day. Once I lose weight, I might be fine. Besides, if I stay in a hospital, I won't be able to update my novel normally. I'm sorry for making all of you worry and wait for me for a long time. Writing a novel is my duty. From today onwards, I'll resume updating my novel. To celebrate me being discharged from the hospital and my decision to lose weight, can you give me a few monthly tickets as encouragement? Also, I want to make a bet with all of you. I want to lose weight in 3 months. At that time, I'll post a picture, and if I don't lose weight, then darn it all, I'll update my novel with 500,000 yuan a month. But if I lose weight, you have to promise me one thing and fulfill one wish of mine. What do you say? Do you want to make a bet? Do you dare? To be continued. If you like this novel, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1019. Once the core entered its mouth, Su Ming tapped a few spots on the wave of tears body with his right hand, causing the core of tears to instantly melt in its body. Then he seized the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears throat, and with a single move, he flung it towards the swarm of waves of tears beside him. The 1,000 feet tall wave of tears body instantly turned completely red. Veins popped up on its skin, and blood flowed out of its eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. It looked incredibly terrifying, as if all its bones, flesh, blood, and tendons had melted away at that instant. A freezing glare shone in Su Ming's eyes. In the face of the countless roaring waves of tears charging towards him from all directions, the 4 gigantic waves of tears that were 80,000-something feet tall, and the waves of Tears King that was 100,000 feet tall, he smiled. At the same time he smiled, Su Ming lifted his right hand. Once he pressed his fingers together, he spread them outwards and, at the same time, he spoke softly. Bang! Almost at the instant Su Ming spoke, a muffled bang came from the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears. That sound overlapped with Su Ming's voice, as if it had been detonated by him. In the mid of that bang, the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears that had swallowed the core of waves of tears was torn to shreds and exploded in all directions. There were no bones, no torn flesh, and neither were there any body parts. When it exploded, blood rained down on the area. It was as if everything in its body had melted at the instant it exploded, and only a layer of skin remained to envelop it. It was like a skin bag filled with water, and as the skin bag shattered, blood gushed out in all directions. There were plenty of waves of tears around the 1,000 feet tall wave of tears. At the instant its body exploded, its blood instantly dyed dozens of waves of tears bodies. The rain of blood seemed normal, but the instant it landed on the dozen or so waves of tears, shrill screams of pain rang out from their mouths. The blood that splashed on the dozen or so waves of tears could be seen with the naked eye. The moment it touched the waves of tears, it seemed to possess some sort of intelligence. The moment it touched the waves of tears, it seemed to corrode them. It penetrated deep into their bodies and fused with their blood. The instant it flowed through his meridians, boom, boom, dozens of booming sounds rose and fell in succession, shocking all the cultivators in Morning Dao sect. The 9 old frail darknesses widened their eyes in shock, and the Catwoman froze. Her face instantly turned pale, and disbelief filled her face. Sui began to pant. She found it difficult to believe what she was seeing. They saw that as the dozen or so waves of tears collapsed, with them, as the center, their blood exploded in all directions. It was as if a sea of blood was roaring. As the sea of blood erupted, hundreds of waves of tears were touched by the blood. One of them was the 80,000-foot-long wave of tears. The cold sneer on Su Ming's lips grew wider. He placed his hands behind his back and stood in the midst of the collapsing sea of blood. The sea of blood that could easily kill the wave of tears was completely useless against him. His indifference and the bloody stench around him, his cold sneer and the forlorn screams around him, his calmness and the madness born from fear formed an incredibly strong contrast. If you want to take what you shouldn't take, then be prepared to face the extermination of your race. When Su Ming said those words flatly, the hundreds of waves of tears let out screams of pain that shook the sky and earth. Their bodies exploded with loud bangs. As for the wave of tears that was 80,000-something feet tall, it roared with indescribable pain. With a single move, it charged toward Su Ming. It was clearly enduring the pain of breaking down to kill Su Ming. Su Ming did not move. He believed in the decaying spirit he had created to exterminate his race. He stared at the 80,000-foot-long wave of tears walking towards him with an aloof gaze. The beast only took one step forward, and right when it got close to Su Ming, its body let out a bang and exploded. Its death was like a death knell that resounded through the entire galaxy. Its gigantic body caused its blood to surpass that of many waves of tears. As it exploded, a vast sea of blood submerged Su Ming's body and swept through the area. Shrill roars filled with terror and madness instantly tumbled out of the waves of tears' mouths. The fighting spirit that had been stirred up by the waves of tears king after much difficulty completely vanished at that moment. The threat of death caused the waves of tears to scatter without regard for anything else. They wanted to leave this place because they were afraid. However, Su Ming's decaying spirit core of waves of tears was an item that could exterminate a race. The further it went, the more shocking it became. When the hundreds of waves of tears collapsed and the blood of the 80,000-foot-long wave of tears splashed in all directions, thousands or even tens of thousands of waves of tears had their blood splashed on their bodies. Booming sounds came from the first wave of tears. Su Ming had personally fed the medicinal core to him, and they never stopped. Loud booming sounds reverberated continuously in the galaxy, and every single time they reverberated in the air, endless screams of pain would rise up, and more waves of tears would become a part of the power of the decaying spirit core. The decaying spirit core of waves of tears could exterminate a race and cause all living beings to decay. This was the power of the decaying spirit core. The sea of blood turned into a gigantic vortex in the galaxy that continued spreading outwards with loud booming sounds. If anyone compared the galaxy to a picture, then they could clearly see that at the edge of the sea of blood in the picture, there were flowers of blood that were continuously blooming as booming sounds rang out. Each of those flowers of blood was the scene of a wave of tears body crumbling. This scene was incredibly beautiful, and it brought with it the funeral song of life. Roar! The waves of tears king, the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears, roared. At that moment, the 100,000 feet tall wave of tears retreated swiftly. Madness appeared on its face, and its eyes were bloodshot. It could only watch helplessly as its tribesmen died shrilly. It watched as its sect elders died. 3 of the 4 old waves of tears that were 80,000 feet tall had already died. Their deaths had nothing to do with their levels of cultivation. It was because of the sea of blood and because of the medicinal core fed to them by that damnable cultivator. It did not know what medicinal core it was, but it was so terrifying that even it, the waves of tears king, shuddered. It did not dare get closer. In fact, it did not even dare let the blood touch it. It had a strong feeling that even if it was the waves of tears, its body would not be able to withstand even a single drop of that blood. This had nothing to do with their levels of cultivation. This was something that the waves of tears could not coexist with. This was a flaw in their lives. Booming sounds continued echoing in the air and spreading out. The number of waves of tears that died increased from hundreds to thousands, then to tens of thousands. By then, the entire galaxy was practically covered by the sea of blood. There were more than 100,000 waves of tears that had died. The remaining ones were the ones at the outermost perimeter, and most of them were only about 100 feet tall. Very few of them were 1,000 feet tall. As for the 10,000 feet tall waves of tears that had been the fastest and closest to Su Ming, all of them had died. Even the 4 old waves of tears that were 80,000 feet tall were shuddering and had escaped by a stroke of luck. If anyone cast their gazes over, they would find that most of the 100,000-something waves of tears in the galaxy had been destroyed. At that moment, there were less than 20,000 of them left. The area was filled with dead silence. All the cultivators in Morning Dao sect were completely shocked by everything before their eyes. They were dumbfounded as they stared at Su Ming in the vast sea of blood before them in a daze. The waves of tears were trembling. Terror and despair that had never appeared before appeared on their faces. Su Ming's figure in the sea of blood had become the deepest part of their memories. In fact, this part of their memories would remain in the brand of their lives and be passed down from generation to generation. While standing in the sea of blood, Su Ming swept his gaze past the remaining waves of tears around him and said flatly, "Either you kneel down and worship me, then get lost, or the waves of tears will be destroyed." His voice shot through the sea of blood and echoed in the galaxy. The waves of tears in the area shuddered and let out pleading cries. Without any hesitation, they knelt down and worshipped Su Ming, who was in the sea of blood. The nearly 20,000 remaining waves of tears chose to kneel down and worship him. When Su Ming looked towards the 100,000 feet tall waves of tears king, pain and struggle appeared on its face. Its body trembled, and after some time, it lowered its head. Its gigantic body silently chose to kneel down and worship Su Ming. The act of kneeling down and worshiping Su Ming might have seemed simple, but to the waves of tears, this action was even more unbearable than death. But if it did not do this, what else could it do? For its race and its people, it had no other choice. All of this was because its clan had provoked someone they couldn't afford to provoke and brought upon themselves a calamity that could not be resolved. That was especially true when it thought about the medicinal pill, and it began to tremble, and fear rose up in its heart. "All of you get lost," Su Ming said flatly. The 100,000 feet tall wave of tears stood up quietly. With a single move, it charged into the distance. Behind it, the remaining 20,000 waves of tears in the area pushed each other to be the first to follow. They charged into the distance, as if they stayed for even one more breath, their minds would be on the verge of breaking down. When Su Ming watched the waves of tears leave, he averted his gaze. He did not choose to truly destroy their race. He turned around and looked at the people from Morning Dao sect behind him. Slowly, a smile appeared at the corners of his lips. Su Ming was dressed in a constellation robe in the sea of blood. His long hair danced in the air, and his expression was calm. However, when he was illuminated by the sea of blood, a strong, distinct, and thick malevolent aura appeared on his handsome face, and it was not held back at all. The sea of blood and the malicious aura seemed to have fused together at that moment, causing Su Ming's appearance and body to be branded deeply into the hearts of all the people in Morning Dao sect. They would not be able to disappear. In fact, Su Ming's gaze caused all the cultivators in Morning Dao sect to feel zealous. They could not help but feel a great wave of respect rise from the bottom of their hearts, and it was different from how they treated Dao Kong. Previously, they had respected him because of Morning Dao sect, but now, they respected him because of Su Ming. Su Hui's expression was slightly complicated. In fact, when Su Ming looked towards her for the first time ever, she instinctively avoided his gaze. "Let's go. We'll continue moving forward to Divine Essence Star Ocean," Su Ming said calmly. "Understood." The united voices came from all the fearless warriors, all the cultivators from Morning Dao sect, from the 9 old men, the Catwoman, and even Su Hui's heart. At that moment, that word echoed uncontrollably in her heart. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1020. Pretentious. He's too good at being pretentious. The 13 warships charged through the galaxy. On the largest warship, the bald crane had an envious look on its face as it continued mumbling under its breath. Darn it all, I should be the one doing this sort of pretentious thing. Huh! The bald crane was crestfallen. By its side, the abyss dragon rolled its eyes. It simply did not want to strike a blow to the bald crane's pride. It did not want to point out how the bald crane had been so terrified that it did not dare to come out of its room when the swarm of waves of tears had appeared a few days ago. Think about it. The handsome and elegant bald crane bathed in a sea of blood that surged into the sky. With a wave of his hand, he rubbed his back, and 100,000 waves of tears died. Then, with another wave of his hand, he rubbed his chest, and the remaining waves of tears knelt down to worship him. Phew, he's too pretentious. Just thinking about it makes me think that he's too dishonest. To his left is the Catwoman. To his right is the woman. Behind him are the 9 old coots, and in front of him are thousands of fearless warriors. The bald crane gritted its teeth, looking incredibly jealous. If I could do this, I would immediately ask everyone to bring out their crystals, but what about him? What about him? He didn't even mention the crystals? This is too wasteful, too shameful, too much of a waste. This won't do. I have to go and reason with him. Abyss Dragon, don't stop me. I have to go today. The bald crane's eyes turned red. It was so angry that it wanted to walk out of the room, but when it took a few steps, it looked at the Abyss Dragon lying on the ground. Don't stop me. I'm not stopping you. The Abyss Dragon sighed and quickly moved away, putting on an innocent look. Oh well, you're right. I shouldn't be so petty. Oh well. A thought appeared in the bald crane's head, then it quickly sat down, putting on a very magnanimous look. What did I say? The Abyss Dragon was momentarily stunned, then scratched its head. Didn't you tell me not to go just now? Huh? I didn't say that. You did. I really didn't. The dragon and crane immediately engaged in an intense discussion about this question in the room. No one else could hear their voices, but Su Ming, who was sitting on the deck of the battleship not too far away, could hear their conversation clearly through the connection he had with the bald crane. Ignoring the bald crane, Su Ming lowered his head and touched his chest. There was no black stone fragment there, but Su Ming was already used to its existence. Even though the black stone fragment was currently in his soul, he still instinctively felt that it was hanging around his neck. The scene from a few days ago appeared in Su Ming's mind. Once the waves of tears left, the sea of blood that surged into the sky gathered together at the instant Su Ming walked out and charged towards him. In the end, it disappeared in a thin air around him. However, Su Ming could sense that the sea of blood did not disappear. Instead, it was sucked away by the black stone fragment. The seed of life extermination. Su Ming closed his eyes. After a long while, when he opened them again, he put down his hand from his chest. Su Ming could guess some of the things related to the seed of life extermination, his Ikang clone, and even the bald crane, but not all of them. However, this was not the time for him to seek confirmation. He wanted to go to Divine Essence Star Ocean and search for Lai Shanxiao. If he could find him, that would be for the best, but if he could not find any clues, then Su Ming would leave the barren lands of Divine Essence with Morning Dao Sect's group. He would leave this place and return to true Morning Dao World, to his former homeland. In fact, if he could return to true Morning Dao World, Su Ming had already decided that he would use another method to take revenge on all of true Morning Dao World. This method would not be to fight head-on, but to replace them indirectly. I will become the strongest among all those with the surname Dao in Morning Dao Sect. I will slowly take control of Morning Dao Sect, and in the end, I will control all of true Morning Dao World. I will become the culpable lord of true Morning Dao World. I will become Dao Chun. At that time, it doesn't matter whether it's the immortals or the wills in Yin Death region. They will all be reduced to ashes. This is the only method that can prevent Tion from noticing me and allow me to retrieve my physical body. A brilliant light shone in Su Ming's eyes, and a hint of a cold sneer appeared on his lips. He was no longer the ignorant teenager he was in the past. He could already be said to be a schemer. It was impossible for Di Tian to think of this method. Su Ming looked at his surroundings. All the cultivators on the 13 warships were his subordinates. They had previously respected Dao Kong, and it was the same at that moment, but Su Ming was Dao Kong. Because of that, these people were his subordinates. Besides, after the matter with the waves of tears, Su Ming could clearly sense that while these people's attitude towards him remained the same, a hint of fanaticism had appeared in their eyes. This fanaticism was not because of Morning Dao sect, but because of Su Ming. In fact, even though the expressions of the 9 old frail darknesses remained the same and did not reveal too many strange expressions, Su Ming could sense that there was a barely noticeable hint of respect in the 9 old men's attitude towards him. There was also a hint of happiness in them, as if they were elders who had seen their juniors grow up. Besides these people, the Catwoman had also changed. Of course, the one who changed the most was Su Hui. She was no longer hidden in space, but was on another warship. Occasionally, her gaze would gather on Su Ming. There was hesitation in her gaze, along with a complicated look, as well as a strange, baffling look. Su Ming closed his eyes and no longer paid any attention to his surroundings. He sensed his own level of cultivation. At that moment, he was already in the middle stage of World Plane Realm. As for his physical body, it was equivalent to those in the later stage of World Plane Realm. If he added the power of Divine Essence to it, then he could fight against those who had attained completion in World Plane Realm. If he borrowed the power of his Akang clone, or if his Akang clone personally came and fused with his other clones, then Su Ming's offensive abilities might not be able to fight against masters of fate, lives, and death, but Lunar Culpa Realm would no longer be a problem for him. Su Ming's Akang clone could even fight against the old monsters in Solar Culpa Realm. This sort of power was something Su Ming had never imagined when he left the land of berserkers in the past, but now he had already mastered it. In silence, Su Ming touched his storage bag. There was still the Divine Essence treasure. Peace arrives when the elephant is here, as well as Dao Avenue Mountain, which he could fully activate. These were all his trump cards. More importantly, he had the poisonous wasp. The poisonous wasp with the God Ascension Nectar was a source that could allow Su Ming's level of cultivation to continue increasing. When he thought of this, Su Ming lowered his head and looked at his right index finger. His index finger might have looked normal, but only Su Ming knew that there was God Ascension Nectar at the tip of his finger. In the end, he had still chosen to keep the God Ascension Nectar. It might have brought danger to him, but as long as he controlled it so that it did not spread out, he could avoid it. It was especially so since there were 13 layers of light around him. This was the protection formed by the 13 warships gathered together. With Su Ming's own cultivation base and the seal, he could ensure that the fragrance of the God Ascension Nectar would not spread out. When he tried to continue melting the God Ascension Nectar, Su Ming had also completely understood Dao Kong's memories, and he had also discovered the mysteries of the sacred constellation robe and the way to use it. Since the sacred constellation robe was something that only the direct descendants of Morning Dao sect could possess, it naturally had its own powerful aspects. After coming to understand it over the past few days, along with Dao Kong's memories, Su Ming had already mastered it. The more people it enslaves, the greater the might of the sacred constellation robe. Based on Dao Kong's sacred constellation robe and his memories, he has nearly 100,000 servants in Morning Dao sect. The power of these 100,000 servants is extraordinary, and he also has 4 great guards. Each of them has the power of those in the later stage of World Plane Realm. However, due to the uniqueness of the barren lands of Divine Essence, they could not follow him here, which is why they stayed outside. Su Ming touched his robe with his right hand, and a smile appeared briefly on his face. There are 3 great effects to the sacred constellation robe. One of them is protection. It can activate its protective power. Different sacred constellation robes have different levels of strength. Dao Kong's sacred constellation robe can withstand a full-powered strike from those in Lunar Culpa Realm. This is much stronger than the direct descendant of Morning Dao sect I killed in the past. That robe in the past could not even fight against the 3 old coots sealed in my soul. It's a telling sign of how weak it is. The scene in the past appeared in Su Ming's eyes. When he looked at it now, the 3 people sealed in his soul were existences similar to the Duke of Crimson Flame. The second effect is to seal divine abilities. This effect is one of the main reasons why this sacred constellation robe is so strong. Once it seals other people's divine abilities, it can learn them on its own, but if it wants to cast this art, it will need enough power and a sufficient number of servants to activate it. As for the third effect, it can turn into a planet, but if it wants to do this, it will need to burn the souls of its servants. If it turns into a planet and controls the essence of an expanse cosmos, it will be able to withstand a full-powered strike from those in Solar Culpa realm. And as this sacred constellation robe becomes stronger, it should be able to turn into a sea of stars. By then, its might will be so great that it can even shake those in Solar Culpa realm. It's a pity that turning into a planet isn't easy. This sacred constellation robe hasn't reached that level yet. Right now, this robe is only at the 4th layer. It's still very far away from the 9th layer. Also, based on Dao Kong's memories, if this sacred constellation robe reaches the 9th layer, it will have other hidden divine abilities. In fact, its color will also change. It will turn silver from its current appearance. In his memories, there were ancient existences among the direct descendants of Morning Dao sect who wore robes that were silver. As for their generation, before Dao Kong came to the barren lands of Divine Abyss, none of them had reached the silver level. Su Ming rubbed the center of his brows, then closed his eyes and sat down quietly to regulate his breathing. Time trickled by. The 13 warships had a rather smooth journey forward this time. They did not run into any more existences like the swarm of waves of tears. Even if they ran into some scattered ferocious beasts, they would either avoid them or kill them. Their journey could be considered to be peaceful. Then, 3 months later, Su Ming and his group finally arrived at the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean. There was a boundless layer of meteors floating there. It was said that they surrounded the entire galaxy. This was a symbol. Once they stepped into this place, it meant that they had entered the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean. Bang, 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 bang. When the 13 warships approached the layer of meteors, they immediately heard this sound. It was very rhythmic, as if the interval between each sound was the same. Su Ming had long since opened his eyes. Almost all the cultivators, including him, saw a thin and frail man squatting on a meteor not too far away. His expression was apathetic, and his right hand was moving rhythmically on the ground. He was digging a hole. When Su Ming looked around, he found that there were already 8 holes around him. There were a lot of shattered stones floating by the side, and it was clear that this man had personally dug them out. During Qingming Festival, it rained in other places, but it snowed in Peony River. Snow floated down from the sky, and for some unknown reason, those who saw it would feel sad. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1021. The man was not tall. At first glance, he looked like a child who had yet to grow up, but if anyone took a closer look, they would be able to tell from the outline of his face that he was already an adult. It was not that he was short, but that he was so thin that he looked as if he could be lifted by a gust of wind. The thin man did not even spare a glance at the 13 warships Su Ming and the others were on. His attention was completely focused on the meteor as he continued digging holes with his right hand. Banging sounds echoed in the air. There was a pattern to his actions, and this scene gave all those who saw it a strange feeling. Su Ming sat on the ship and cast his gaze on the thin man. He might have only swept his gaze past him, but at the instant he looked at him, he sensed the ripples of power coming from the man's body. Those were not the ripples of power belonging to a cultivator, but something Su Ming was familiar with and had even seen before, the ripples of power belonging to a shaman. This was a shaman, a battle shaman. Su Ming narrowed his eyes. He lifted his right hand and swung his arm. Immediately, The 13 warships stopped moving forward slowly. They stopped not too far away from the thin man on the meteor beyond the group of meteors in Divine Essence Star Ocean. From the start until the end, the thin man did not spare a single glance at Su Ming and the others. He continued digging holes, and when the time it takes for about half an incense stick to burn past, he dug out a deep hole with his hand. There were 8 such holes around him. His actions aroused the curiosity of the cultivators from Morning Dao sect. When they looked over, Su Ming shook his head. The ripples of power belonging to the shamans on the thin man's body were very mixed. There were also the presences of some other races within them. He was not a pure shaman. Ignore him. Let's go, Su Ming said flatly. As Su Ming spoke, the 13 warships immediately moved forward slowly. As they got closer and entered the group of meteors, a strange, piercing cry suddenly came from the depths of the group of meteors, and it turned into a wave of sound that surged out like a tidal wave. Along with the sound wave, 9 beams of light appeared. The 9 beams of light moved with incredible speed as they pierced through the meteorites. In the blink of an eye, they were standing in front of the emaciated man on the meteorite with the 9 craters on it. The long arcs disappeared, revealing 9 people with disheveled hair. Their clothes were clearly different from those of cultivators. They looked like long robes made from beast skins, and there were many colors on their faces, causing others to be unable to see their faces clearly. They could only see ferocious totems drawn on their faces. Those totems were ferocious figures of white and red intersecting with each other. Along with their shining, chilling gazes, they immediately gave off an incredibly dangerous feeling. He couldn't tell the ages of these 9 people, but he could tell that there were no women among them, especially the one in the lead, who held a thick black bone staff in her hand. Looking at the appearance of the bone staff, it was clearly the leg bone of a fierce beast. Red threads intersected with each other and shone with a strange and enchanting light. The appearance of the 9 people instantly caused a primitive and violent presence to crash into the faces of the people from Morning Dao sect. Galloping fighters. They are a normal race in the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean. There are about 1,000 of them, and each of them loves to kill. They are incredibly brutal, and they do not have much contact with the world outside. In Black Ink Planet's records, this race is an uncivilized race. The Catwoman beside Su Ming immediately said softly. Almost at the instant the Catwoman's voice reached Su Ming's ears, the 9 galloping fighters on the meteors threw their heads back and roared simultaneously. The freezing glare in their eyes grew stronger. They first cast a glance at Su Ming and the others, then charged towards the thin man from 9 different directions. I missed one. A cold and apathetic voice tumbled out of the thin man's mouth. He lifted his head swiftly, and veins popped up on his right hand. At the instant he roared, an eerie, chilling glare shone in his teeth. At that moment, his teeth also changed and became much sharper. He first brought out an herb from his bosom and placed it in his mouth to chew. Then he bent down and picked up a stone he had dug out from the hole. With a single move, he charged toward the 9 people. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and a slight hint of interest rose in him. He was not interested in the man, but the herb he was chewing. Su Ming's understanding towards medicinal herbs allowed him to guess with just one glance that the herb was not used to treat injuries, but contained some sort of poison. However, his interest was not great, and he could not look at it for long. The 13 warships continued moving forward and gradually brushed past the meteors, looking as if they were about to leave into the distance. The thin man let out a roar on the meteor and instantly crashed into a galloping fighter. A loud bang shot into the air, and his chest was heavily injured, but he laughed ferociously, completely unbothered by it. He rammed his head against the galloping fighter's forehead, then opened his mouth wide and bit down on the man's throat. With a yank, blood gushed out, and the thin man instantly retreated. Shrill screams of pain reverberated in the air. The galloping fighter who had his throat bitten out also retreated while clutching his neck. He might have stopped the bleeding, but he could not stop the black from spreading. It was poison, and it came from the thin man's teeth. It was poison from the herb he had chewed just then. Poison isn't bad. Su Ming saw all of this and averted his gaze. The thin man moved incredibly quickly on the meteor. As he retreated, he turned around swiftly and crushed the stone in his right hand. At the instant it turned into powder, he struck his chest and coughed up a mouthful of blood. His blood fused with the powder and started burning, turning into a firebird that charged towards another galloping fighter. At the same time, he let out a roar and rushed towards another galloping fighter. After a moment, screams of pain reverberated in the air, and 2 more galloping fighters died in the thin man's hands. When he attacked, there was madness and bloodlust in him. Every single part of his body could be turned into a weapon for him to kill. However, when 4 of the 9 galloping fighters died, a dark light shone in the eyes of the alien with the bone staff. He opened his mouth and bit down on the bone staff. With a loud crack, he crushed a small piece of bone, and as he chewed on it, he lifted the bone staff in his hand and pressed it against the center of his brows. At the same time, his body began to tremble rapidly, and his body instantly became thin and weak. In the blink of an eye, he was only skin and bones. The red threads on the bone staff also began to squirm. Almost at the instant when the foreign being became thin and weak, a thick black fog suddenly erupted from the bone staff. The fog was thick, and when it appeared, it tumbled about before turning into a black snake made of fog. As it hissed, it charged towards the thin man. At that moment, the 13 warships Su Ming was on had already left the meteor where the thin man was and entered the group of meteors. Su Ming did not pay too much attention to the battle and slaughter behind him. He could also tell that it did not matter whether it was the thin man or the galloping fighters. All of them looked as if they were looking down on them. They were completely unbothered by the fact that they were fighting to the death right in front of them. And since Su Ming did not give any orders, all the cultivators on the 13 warships would not attack on their own. Instead, they watched coldly as the ships moved forward. When the thin man saw the fog snake coming towards him, his pupils shrank, and he swiftly retreated, but the remaining 4 galloping fighters chased after him with bloodthirst and murderous intent. Ruthlessness appeared in his eyes. He stopped moving, but instead of retreating, he moved forward and charged towards the 4 people. Both sides clashed against each other, and booming sounds instantly reverberated in the air. Screams of pain rang out. One of the 4 had his neck twisted, another had his heart dug out, another had his body torn apart, and the last had his skull crushed by the thin man ramming his head against it. In the blink of an eye, the 4 galloping fighters died a miserable death. The thin man staggered. His right arm was paralyzed, and there was a wound on his abdomen from which blood flowed out continuously. However, he did not even spare a glance. Just as he was about to rush towards the final galloping fighter with the bone staff in his hand, the 4 people who had died by his feet suddenly opened their eyes in shock. A gray light shone in their eyes. Almost at the instant the gray color appeared, the thin man's body trembled. It was as if a sealing power had spread out from the eyes of the 4 dead galloping fighters, and at that instant, his body was sealed to the point where he could not move. The fog snake hissed and closed in on the thin man in the span of breath. It bit down on his head as if it wanted to devour his entire body. The thin, galloping fighter with the bone staff in his hand sat cross-legged on the ground. A hint of a cold sneer appeared at the corners of his lips, but almost at the moment it appeared, it immediately turned into shock. It was also at that moment that Su Ming, who was originally on the 13 warships that had already left into the distance, shuddered. He stood up swiftly and turned around to stare at the battlefield on the meteors behind him. His breathing quickened at that instant. He lifted his right hand and swung his arm, and the 13 warships immediately stopped in the group of meteors. With a bang, Su Ming saw the fog snake around the thin man's body shatter into pieces, and a gigantic, illusory figure appeared behind the thin man. It was a giant covered in black fur. There was an old man sitting cross-legged on the giant's head. His body was also an illusion and could not be seen clearly, just like the giant. It did not matter whether it was the giant or the old man. They were the shamans' deities of the shamans. After being worshipped by the shamans for many years, they could allow the shamans to borrow their divine abilities, and they were similar to the berserker statues of the god of berserkers. What caused Su Ming to lose his composure was not the giant, but the old man on the giant's head. During that instant just now, when the thin man brought out his race's deity of the shamans, Su Ming had sensed a strong sense of familiarity. That familiarity caused his heart to tremble, and when he saw the old man on the giant's head with his own eyes, his heart trembled. The old man's face might be indistinct and his body might be an illusion, but the white robe he wore and the memories Su Ming would never forget were enough to make him tremble. "Master," Su Ming mumbled. Only he could hear his voice. The illusory figure on the giant's head was Tian Xiezi. "Please recommend me." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:22. Tian Xiezi was truly Su Ming's first master. He was the pillar of the ninth summit and one of the three great berserkers of the land of South Morning. In fact, his origins were incredibly mysterious. No one else knew about him, but his disciples did. Their master had once left Death region and became the disciple of a sect elder of Morning Dao sect. He had only accepted 4 disciples in his life. His eldest disciple was the shaman tribe's 9 Li tribes' inheritance. He was the current shaman lord. His level of cultivation was not high, but his will was enough to defy the heavens. For the sake of becoming stronger, he did not hesitate to be used by Tian. He used Tian's power to cut off his own head and turned into Shingon. With the great axe in hand, he could shake the heavens. The second disciple's name was Hua. He was gentle and elegant, but his body was that of a phantom king. No one knew how long he had lived for. He wandered the world and was worshipped by all phantoms. If it was not because the land of berserkers was too small, and if he could walk out of Death vortex, then his future would be limitless. The third disciple might seem foolish, but he was formed from the formation treasure that sealed Death land. All restrictions and formations were non-existent before him. He was loyal, and he was adept at the Dream Dao technique. If he mastered this technique, he would be able to shake the heavens. His body was in the land of immortals, and his soul was in the barren lands of divine essence. He was the berserker's 4th god of berserkers. He used his Akang clone and had the seed of life extermination. His life was full of twists and turns, and he encountered endless serendipities. His cultivation-based clone could enter the core of true Morning Dao world, and his clone that practiced the art of swallowing hollow shadows whole could cultivate the strongest body in the world. If there came a day when all his clones fused into one with his physical body, then his strength would be indescribable. If anyone had these 4 great disciples, then there was no need to mention how illustrious that person was. Tian Xiezi had taught Su Ming how to change his heart and allowed him to find the method to clear his mind. He had also opened up Su Ming's path of cultivation, allowing him to possess the heart of a powerful warrior that allowed him to reach his current height. The shock in Su Ming's heart was so great that it was difficult to describe it with words. At that moment, his body trembled as he stared at the illusory figure above the giant's head. He had not expected that he would find his master's tracks in divine essence Star Ocean. Back then, Tian Xiezi's disappearance was a pain in their hearts. They swore that they would find their master no matter what. Even if their master was no longer around, they would use the blood of the heavens to avenge their master. Right then, Su Ming was alone in divine essence Star Ocean. His senior brother was in true Morning Dao world. They had been separated for 1,000-something years, but Su Ming's heart as a disciple of Ninth Summit had never changed. No matter what, he would always be a member of the Ninth Summit, and he would always be Tian Xiezi's 4th disciple. Master, Su Ming had an urge that he could not control, but he was no longer the teenager in the past. He knew that being impulsive would not be of much use, and if he exposed his thoughts, he would usually only get half the results with twice the effort. He forced down the impulse in his heart and watched as the giant threw its head back and roared in rage. He watched as the thin man charged forward at an incredible speed. In an instant, he closed in on the galloping fighter, lifted his right hand, and threw a punch. The bone staff shattered to pieces, and the galloping fighter coughed up blood. With some unknown method, his body tumbled backwards, avoiding the killing intent by a hair's breadth. He retreated swiftly and headed towards the 13 warships where Su Ming was. The thin man chased after him without hesitation. A cold glare immediately appeared in the eyes of the cultivators on the 13 warships. Some of them even stood up. The Catwoman's gaze also focused on the incoming galloping fighter and the thin man. A mighty pressure immediately spread out from the 13 warships and locked onto the incoming galloping fighter and the thin man. Let them come here. Once Su Ming spoke, the mighty pressure from the 13 warships immediately spread out. The incoming galloping fighter immediately spoke anxiously to Su Ming and the others, but his words were complicated and difficult to understand. It was impossible to understand what he meant, but based on his expression and condition, he was definitely asking for help. He asked us to save him, and he is willing to use the strange treasure of his race to repay us, the Catwoman said softly. Su Ming did not speak. Instead, he stared at the thin man and saw him coughing up blood as he chased after him. His body instantly turned into blood fog, and his speed increased exponentially. At the instant the galloping fighter stepped onto one of the warships, the thin man caught up to him. The fog shot through his body, and booming sounds reverberated in the air. The galloping fighter immediately bled from his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and died. He fell on the warship. The fog gathered together and turned into the thin man. He glared at the people from Morning Dao sect fiercely, then bent his body like a ferocious beast. He slowly retreated and grabbed the dead galloping fighter. Just as he was about to leave, Su Ming spoke. Which shaman tribe are you from? Who is your great patriarch? The people from Morning Dao sect could not understand Su Ming's words, and they were all stunned. This was the language of the shamans, and Su Ming had learned it when he was in the shaman tribe in the past. The thin man originally wanted to retreat, but when he heard Su Ming's words, his footsteps came to a halt. He cast a deep glance at Su Ming, who was on the other warship, then grabbed the corpse and left the warship. He returned to the meteor where he had dug a pit. Once he placed the corpses into the pit, he grabbed another corpse and pushed it against the ground. He did it several times until a deep pit was created, and he threw the corpse inside. Once he did so, he turned his head around again and looked at Su Ming, who was on the warship. He suddenly lifted his right hand and made a gesture of killing before his neck. A freezing glare appeared in his eyes, and he moved, intending to leave into the distance. Su Ming let out a cold harumph, and a profound look appeared in his eyes. A power that could capture souls swiftly spread out from his eyes, turning into ripples in the galaxy around him. That power that could capture souls descended on the thin man's body as Su Ming looked at him. The man's charging footsteps came to a halt once again. He turned his head around, and for the first time, a surprised look appeared on his face. He lifted his right hand and struck his body. Immediately, he coughed up blood, and his body turned into blood fog again. He instantly turned into a blood shadow, and his speed increased exponentially. Without any hesitation, Su Ming took a step forward. All of you, continue moving forward and find a safe place to stay. Wait for my return. I will be able to find you with the connection between me and the ship. As Su Ming spoke, he had already walked out of the ship. Before the 9 old frail darknesses could speak, Su Ming's voice reached them once again. No one is allowed to go with me, including you, Su Hui. This is my order. I could choose not to go, but you must bring Xianli with you. She has lived in Divine Essence Star Ocean for hundreds of years, and she understands many of the customs here, Su Hui said calmly from another warship. If Su Ming had not gone through the matter with the waves of tears, he might have been able to order the others with his words, but Su Hui would have ignored him. It was different now. Even she would hesitate for a moment when she heard Su Ming's words. No! Su Ming's voice came from the distance. He turned into a long arc and charged through the group of meteors. No one noticed that when Su Ming left, the bald crane was swinging its body in the bald crane's room on his ship. It covered the abyss dragon, turned into dust, and left the ship without a single sound. As it floated in the air, it charged in the direction Su Ming had left. The 9 old frail darknesses were silent. They cast each other a glance. They wanted to chase after Su Ming and protect him, but Su Ming's words were firm and clear. In silence, they sighed in their hearts, but they did not force themselves to follow him, because they saw that Su Hui had already disappeared. The 13 ships moved forward slowly, heading to the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean in search of a safe place to wait for their young master's return. Su Ming did not move at full speed in the group of meteors. Instead, he chased after the thin man in front of him from a distance. The illusory statue of the shaman on the man's body was a clue that Su Ming was determined to obtain. Besides, this matter was incredibly important to Su Ming, which was why he chased after him alone. After a moment, as he chased after the man, Su Ming lifted his right hand and swung it behind him. Immediately, banging sounds came from the space behind him, and the black and yellow dogs that were the abyss dragon appeared beside him. The black dog that was the bald crane winked at Su Ming and even wagged its tail, looking as if it wanted to curry favor with Su Ming. Chase after him. Su Ming glared at the bald crane. The bald crane quickly nodded and let out a few loud roars in the direction of the thin man's back in the distance. With a whoosh, it charged forward. The big yellow dog followed behind it in a lackadaisical manner, occasionally looking into the distance. The thin man frowned in the group of meteors. Killing intent flashed briefly in his eyes, but he did not stop moving. His instincts told him that the person chasing after him was the strongest person he had ever met. He did not have the confidence to win against this sort of person. What surprised him even more was that this person knew how to speak the language of shamans and knew the title of patriarch. In fact, he even had a vague feeling that he found a hint of familiarity that belonged to the shamans on this person. The man's gaze just now had even given him the feeling that he was a soul catcher. When the thin man saw that the man was still chasing after him, he let out a cold harumph and swiftly changed his direction to charge to the right. He moved through the meteors, and his speed increased with each passing moment. Su Ming looked at the man coldly from behind. He wanted to see just where this person would go and was not in a hurry to chase after him. After all, by the looks of it, this person would not easily give Su Ming the answer he wanted. Days passed by, and in the blink of an eye, half a month went by. During this half a month, Su Ming maintained a certain distance between him and the man. It was not too much, and it was not too little. This distance was enough for the man to pose a threat to him, and because of it, he continuously oppressed the man for half a month. This sort of oppressive pressure was enough to make a person with a slightly weaker will break down. Su Ming had been skilled in this sort of hunting since he was young, and he was even more familiar with it now. Of course, if the bald crane was not continuously nagging him along the way, then perhaps it would have been even better. Hey, grandson, don't run so quickly. Let your grandpa crane rest for a while. Oh my, you're still running? Darn it all, you brat, you have crystals on you. I can smell it. Don't run. Just you wait. When I catch up to you, I'll have Big Yellow bite your butt off. The big yellow dog was already used to the bald crane's teasing. It rolled its eyes and ignored it, but for some unknown reason, it also had the urge to rush out and bite the man's butt. Please recommend me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1023. Su Ming's expression was calm as he moved through the group of meteors. He would occasionally cast a glance at his fingertips, where the god Ascension nectar was hidden. Without the protection of the 13 warships, the presence of the god Ascension nectar could no longer be hidden. Fortunately, once he chased away the waves of tears, Su Ming had continuously melted the God Ascension nectar on the warships, causing the presence to dissipate quite a bit. It might still be around, but if Su Ming used his power to suppress and seal it, he could reduce the presence to its lowest level. However, if he brought out his full power, he would be unable to avoid the presence of the God Ascension nectar spreading out. However, the Thin Man had revealed Tian Xiezi's whereabouts just then, and Su Ming would not be at ease if he let an outsider do this, which was why he had personally ventured out. He had been chasing after the man for half a month, but he had not lured any ferocious beasts to this place. Su Ming gradually relaxed. He wanted to slowly wear down the Thin Man's will, and in the end, he would use the soul catcher art to find clues about his master. After half a month of pursuit, another 3 days passed, and Su Ming left the group of meteors. What appeared before him was a vast galaxy. There was an endless amount of dust in it, and there were even fragments that looked like they belonged to planets that had shattered. There was a broken ground, rotting ancient trees, and a gray, broken skeleton. The galaxy was like an ocean, and these broken things were a part of it. The starry sky here was not pitch black, but gray. An ancient feeling would appear in the heart of anyone who saw this starry sky for the first time. It was difficult to wipe it away. It was ancient, and even had a hint of savagery to it. Aside from that, there was only silence. There was no end to it. The darkness in the distance was hidden in gray. If anyone looked at it for an extended period of time, they would be unable to help but feel an oppressive feeling rise in them, making it difficult for them to breathe. In fact, even the speed of their heartbeats would slowly slow down until they would rot away along with the galaxy. The galaxy was too big, which was why even if a living creature appeared in this place, it would be difficult for it to break the silence. In the distance, there was a black creature that had the body of a snake and the head of a tiger on a shattered stone that was several tens of thousands of feet big. Its body was wrapped around the stone, and in its mouth was a ferocious beast in the shape of a dragon. Its purple eyes stared coldly at the unwelcome guest who had walked out of the group of meteors, Su Ming. Su Ming looked around him and sensed an ancient presence crashing into his face. This was the periphery of divine essence Star Ocean. This place was a place where cultivators rarely came. It was just a step away from being known as a forbidden ground. There was a person crouching on a gigantic, broken skeleton in the distance. That person was the Thin Man who had chased after Su Ming. He was crouching on the ground, and his gaze was cold as he stared at Su Ming. A scimitar had appeared in his left hand. The scimitar was gray, and it was made of bone. As for his right hand, it was currently pressed against the bone beneath him. His 5 fingers carried some sort of strange knocking motion. Every time he knocked, the color of the bone would fade a little. Divine Essence Star Ocean. Su Ming mumbled softly. As he looked around him, he suddenly felt that even though this was the first time he saw everything here, he did not find it unfamiliar. This didn't mean that he had been here before or in some unknown period of time. It was just that he felt a sense of déjà vu towards the wilderness, the vicissitudes, and the primeval nature of this place. It was the same for Deathland. Hiss. A piercing sound tumbled out of the Thin Man's mouth. He crouched on the skeleton and lifted the bone blade in his left hand horizontally. As the hissing sound reverberated in the air, the galaxy immediately looked as if it had become different. The broken stones pointed their tips at Su Ming without him realizing it, and all sorts of venomous insects that could survive in the galaxy crawled out of the rotting ancient trees. The skeletons floating in the galaxy also seemed to possess some sort of intelligence at that moment. A barely discernible hostility rose from them, and it refused to disappear. In fact, the ferocious beast with the body of a snake and the head of a tiger on the shattered stone swallowed the creature in its mouth in one gulp, and hostility appeared in its purple eyes. This was rejection. It was a rejection from the entire divine essence Star Ocean towards the people from the outside world. It was a power that could not be described with words. If the entire divine essence Star Ocean was a will, then this will's indifference and rejection towards all outsiders would be the power of rejection. When outsiders came here, they would have to face all the hostility from the entire divine essence star ocean, regardless of whether it was the universe or all the lives in it. This hostility was born from rejection, and it could turn into a curse. Right then, Su Ming's arrival was like a lantern in the darkness. It might not seem strange, but to divine essence star ocean, it was incredibly clear, and it did not fit in. This was also the Thin Man's plan. He had clearly known since a long time ago that all outsiders who came to divine essence star ocean would be rejected. This power of rejection did not exist beyond the meteors, and neither would it appear within them. However, once they moved through the meteors and stepped into the periphery of divine essence star ocean, it would instantly appear. Using this repulsive force, he was able to defeat those with a higher cultivation base than him. In fact, he could even remember using this method to turn the heads of outsiders into his own wealth a few times. At that moment, the Thin Man's expression was cold and dark. Just as he was about to take action, Su Ming cast the Thin Man a glance, and their gazes met through the galaxy. At the instant their gazes met, the Thin Man bared his teeth at Su Ming. When he did so, there was a hint of ferociousness in his expression. Compared to the Thin Man's hostility, Su Ming's expression was calm. He smiled faintly. He could sense the rejection in this place, and he could guess the Thin Man's thoughts. Su Ming did not say anything else. He lifted his head and untied the ribbon binding his hair with his right hand, letting it fall over his shoulders. Ripples appeared on the sacred constellation robe on his body, and as it changed, it turned into something that looked like beast skin. His skin was no longer yellowish-white, but had gradually turned slightly brownish-black. His face was no longer handsome, but filled with determination. He lifted his right hand and slowly touched his face. Under the Thin Man's stunned gaze, Su Ming slowly drew a bloody line between his nose and his eyes with his fingernail. Blood flowed out of the wound. Once Su Ming wiped it away, a scar that he had left when he was in the land of berserkers appeared on his face. Su Ming lifted his head. At the instant he did so, the Thin Man's expression changed drastically in the distance. Disbelief appeared on his face once again. In fact, this time, his expression far surpassed that of when Su Ming had spoken the shaman's language. His body shuddered violently because at that moment, Su Ming no longer gave him the feeling that he was a person from the world outside. In fact, even his presence had completely changed. It turned into an ancient, savage, primitive, and ancient presence. It turned into a presence that might still be slightly different from that of divine essence star ocean, but it was clearly of the same origin. This was something he could not understand. This was something that had appeared in his mind, causing him to be unable to accept it for a period of time. In fact, if he had not seen it with his own eyes, he would definitely not believe that this person was someone from the world outside. It did not matter whether it was his appearance, his presence, or even his soul. All of them gave off a strong feeling that they came from the same origin as divine essence star ocean. This sort of change was difficult for him to accept. In his memories, he had seen people from the world outside disguising themselves as the cultivators from divine essence star ocean. However, no matter how similar their disguises were, even if they could not tell the difference based on their language, the unique presence from divine essence star ocean could not be grasped. That presence was the key to identifying them. Yet at that moment, the presence on Su Ming's body was so thick that it was even purer than that of a person born in divine essence star ocean. In the galaxy, the shattered stones that had their tips pointed at Su Ming gradually relaxed. They no longer did so, but drifted about in the galaxy as they usually did. The venomous insects that crawled out of the rotting ancient trees also disappeared at that moment. As long as no one came to provoke them, they would not come out. At that moment, all of them crawled back into the rotten trees and disappeared without a trace. The faint hostility from the broken skeletons had also completely disappeared, as if the spirits that had gathered on them had once again fallen into a deep slumber. As for the ferocious beast with the body of a snake and the head of a tiger coiled around the shattered stones, it opened its mouth. The murderous aura on its body disappeared, replaced by a lackadaisical expression. It lay down on the shattered stones again and closed its eyes to digest the food in its body. It was as if it could sense that the hostility between Su Ming and the Thin Man was an internal conflict within Divine Essence Star Ocean. As long as he did not take the initiative to provoke it, it would not interfere. The feeling of repulsion from the galaxy around them also disappeared without a trace at that moment. "Which tribe are you from?" The Thin Man glared at Su Ming, then suddenly opened his mouth and said his first words to Su Ming. His voice was incredibly cold, just like his person, and he spoke in the language of the shamans. Su Ming stood there. Just as he was about to speak, the Thin Man's eyes suddenly darkened. He leaped forward and closed in on Su Ming in an instant. The blade of the scimitar in his left hand was pointed outwards, and it sliced through Su Ming's neck with a freezing glare in the air. It was so quick that even though the blade was made of bone, it still stirred up the sound of air being sliced apart, as if it could slice through space itself. If anyone was touched by it, then forget about a normal physical body. Even those with a certain level of sturdiness would not be able to avoid being injured. However, at the instant the sharp blade touched Su Ming's neck, a sound that sounded like metal clashing against metal rang out. The Thin Man's expression changed drastically. Without any hesitation, he turned around and went behind Su Ming. With his right hand that was not holding onto the bone blade, he pushed his palm towards Su Ming's back. "Dark Mountain Tribe." Su Ming did not stop speaking. When he said those words flatly, he took a step back, and his back immediately crashed into the Thin Man. With a bang, the Thin Man coughed up blood. The bone blade in his hand shattered, and his right hand trembled. As his expression changed, he threw his head back and roared. As he roared, the air around him immediately distorted, and a gigantic illusory figure manifested behind him. To be continued. If you like this work, please come at Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 1024. When Su Ming looked at the Thin Man's statue of the god of shamans at such a close distance, he could clearly see that the giant had black fur and was dressed in coarse bee skins. A primitive and barbaric presence came crashing into his face. An old man in black robes was sitting cross-legged and meditating on its messy head. That black robe covered his face, so his face could not be seen. However, with just one glance, Su Ming could tell that the old man was his master. However, his master's robes were black in the statue of the god of shamans this time. It was different from before, and this made a thought appear in Su Ming's heart. At the same time, veins popped up on the Thin Man's body. It let out a roar, and immediately, the illusion of the giant behind him lifted its gigantic right hand, clenched its fist, and hurled a punch toward Su Ming. Almost at the instant the fist closed in on him, Su Ming took a step forward. The instant their fists collided, Su Ming disappeared, and when he reappeared, he was already on top of the illusory giant's head, right beside the black-robed Tian Xiazi. The familiar presence and the familiar feeling made Su Ming forget where he was at that moment. He looked at the old man, and even if it was just an illusion, it was still a sight that he cherished even more. "Master!" In silence, Su Ming bowed towards the black-robed old man sitting cross-legged on the giant's head. But before he could finish bowing, the Thin Man roared again, and a totem quickly appeared on his forehead. It was the image of a mountain. It was a picture of a mountain. Once that picture appeared, a sharp presence instantly erupted from his body and charged toward Su Ming. From the distance, it looked as if he had turned into the tip of a mountain and was using his body to ram into Su Ming. Su Ming frowned. As he turned around, he lifted his right hand. Just as he was about to strike the Thin Man, he suddenly saw the picture at the center of his brows. When he looked at it, Su Ming's heart trembled, and he withdrew most of his power from the palm he was about to strike. A loud bang shot into the air. Su Ming did not move, but the Thin Man coughed up blood and tumbled backwards. When he looked at Su Ming, there was a hint of puzzlement in his eyes. As he retreated swiftly, 5 wisps of black smoke spread out from the fingers of his right hand. Once they changed several times as if he was forming a seal, he pointed at the skeleton in the distance where he had been previously. Immediately, the skeleton shuddered. Dark flames lit up in the broken skull. As the body trembled, it lifted the skull. At the same time, the dark flames spread out and connected the entire skeleton to form a skeletal beast standing in the galaxy. This was a skeletal beast that had wings when it was alive. Once it stood up, a pair of bone wings spread open on both sides of its body. It charged forward, and with a speed that was akin to the span of a breath, it instantly appeared beneath the Thin Man. Once it picked him up, it charged into divine essence star ocean into the distance. Su Ming stood there in a daze. The picture at the center of the Thin Man's brows appeared in his mind. That mountain was incredibly familiar. It was the 9th summit. Su Ming found it difficult to quell the excitement in his heart. If he had some guesses when he saw his master just now, then when he saw the 9th summit, he was incredibly certain that his master had definitely been here before. In fact, he had been here for a very long time, or else it would have been impossible for him to have transformed into a tribe. And there was a high possibility that his master was still in divine essence star ocean. When he thought of this, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he instantly moved forward. The bald crane and the abyss dragon had run to the bones in the area to search through them, while Su Ming was fighting against the Thin Man. When they saw Su Ming leaving into the distance, they quickly followed behind him. The Duke of Crimson Flame's shift was used by Su Ming at that moment. With one move, he disappeared, and when he reappeared, he was already far away. He could see the Thin Man standing on the skeletal beast not too far away, glaring at him. If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't have let you run so far away. I have 3 questions. If you answer them, then I will set you free, Su Ming said calmly. Hesitation appeared on the Thin Man's face. He opened his mouth, but just as he was about to speak, his expression suddenly changed drastically. A vortex suddenly appeared in the galaxy behind him, and like a gaping mouth, it swallowed the skeletal beast along with his body. This scene happened too suddenly. Su Ming's eyes focused, but soon his expression calmed down. He did not show any signs of wanting to move forward, but instead sat down cross-legged in the galaxy with an indifferent expression on his face. Days passed. 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. When half a month went by, Su Ming remained seated. There was not a hint of impatience on his face. During that half a month, the area around him was quiet. Su Ming did not see any ferocious beasts or alien races from divine essence star ocean passing by. When another 3 days went by, a ray of red light suddenly appeared at the spot where the Thin Man and the skeletal beast had been devoured half a month ago, and it instantly charged into the distance. That red light naturally belonged to the Thin Man. At that moment, his body was surrounded by blood fog, and his expression was incredibly dark. There was also anger on his face. In fact, there was even a faint black line on his face. Su Ming smiled faintly and stood up. With a step forward, he continued chasing after the Thin Man. The Thin Man was an extraordinary schemer. It did not matter whether it was his act of attacking first, leaving the skeletal beast behind, or his act of being devoured half a month ago. All of them showed just how cunning he was. However, in Su Ming's eyes, all of this was like a child playing around. He could see everything clearly with just one glance. This was divine essence star ocean, the Thin Man's homeland. He might not know everything about this place, but he definitely knew quite a lot about it. Besides, the direction in which he fled was not Su Ming's, but the man's own choice. He had also left the skeletal beast behind to flee, so he had enough time to choose his path. That was why there was an 8/10 of a chance that his disappearance and being devoured had been a trick. Besides, the terror on a man's face might have seemed real, but in Su Ming's eyes, which had a lot of experience, he could still find some clues. If he thought about it carefully, he would be able to guess the truth. That was why Su Ming was not in a hurry. He was certain that the man would not be able to hide for too long. After all, As Su Ming smiled faintly, he spoke calmly. If you don't heal your poison soon, it will only become worse. When Su Ming's voice landed in the escaping thin man's ears, his expression changed, but he gritted his teeth and did not turn his head back. His blood escape became even faster. Su Ming frowned and shifted. In an instant, he appeared several hundreds of feet behind the man. Just as he was about to shift again, his pupils suddenly shrank. A strong sense of danger instantly enveloped his heart, and that danger came from the space before him. When he looked over, the space there was calm. There was nothing strange about it. In fact, there was nothing there, be it shattered stones or dust. However, the strong sense of danger told Su Ming that there was a murderous aura hidden in the calmness that could threaten him. At that moment, a voice that sounded like an old man's mumbling echoed in the galaxy. At the instant it appeared, the thin man's footsteps came to a sudden halt. His face instantly turned pale, and without any hesitation, he started retreating, but suddenly, an endless amount of ripples appeared out of nowhere beside the man. Those ripples covered an area of several hundreds of thousands of feet. As they spread out, they immediately formed the outline of a gigantic fish in the galaxy. That fish had 9 sharp spikes, and its true form could not be seen. Su Ming could only tell its general shape from the ripples. If he looked at it from a close distance, he might not be able to see it clearly, but if he looked from the distance, since there was not a single ripple in the galaxy around him, the area where the ripples had appeared became incredibly clear. It was a gigantic, ferocious beast hidden in space. At that moment, the thin man was right next to the ferocious beast's mouth. Su Ming saw with his own eyes that the ferocious beast seemed to have opened its mouth as the ripples spread out violently. The scene from half a month ago appeared before Su Ming's eyes with an astonishing degree of similarity. The thin man's eyes were bloodshot. He retreated madly, but his body started slowing down right before his eyes, as if there was a wave of power gathering on his body to interfere with his movements, causing his movements to become much slower than usual. Without any hesitation, Su Ming took a step forward and shifted. At the instant the ferocious beast was about to devour the thin man, he appeared beside him. He grabbed the thin man's shoulder, and with a solemn expression, he retreated swiftly. However, at the instant he moved back, he immediately felt as if his body was rotting away. It was as if there were countless threads he could not see surrounding him, causing his speed to instantly become incredibly slow. When Su Ming saw that he was in danger and that the ferocious beast's mouth was about to close in on him to devour him, a glint appeared in his eyes. He lifted his left hand and struck the center of his brows. When he opened his mouth, a ray of white light shot out. That white light was a white jade the size of a palm. Once it flew out, it immediately swelled up in front of Su Ming. Peace arrives when the elephant is here. Su Ming let out a low shout, and countless runic symbols that rose and fell appeared around him. Each of them contained the power of his divine essence. They instantly flew out and fused into the white jade. Immediately, the speed at which it swelled up became several times faster than before. Malicious spirit takes over the elephant. Shockingly, a white elephant appeared out in the starry sky, accompanied by a shrill cry. A balancing scale materialized, which was held up by a gigantic evil ghost. On one side was the elephant, and on the other side was the wild beast hidden in the void. Both sides began to weigh each other. 3 coins and 7 taels of silver. A buzzing sound came from the malicious spirit's mouth, and an enraged roar came from the ferocious beast hidden in space. Its body swiftly shrank, and a destructive power erupted from its body. With a bang, the galaxy trembled. A powerful wave of impact pushed outwards in all directions, and Su Ming continued retreating. He grabbed the thin man with one hand and pointed at the malicious spirit with the other. In the midst of the booming sounds, the malicious spirit disappeared, and the elephant disappeared. It turned back into a white jade the size of a palm and charged toward Su Ming. Once Su Ming caught it, sweat broke out at the center of his brows. Su Ming charged backwards and immediately left with the thin man. Ripples spread out behind them, and the ferocious beast hidden in space did not die. Instead, it continued letting out angry and pained roars. The thin man's face was pale, but there was a clear black line piercing through the top of his skull. He looked at Su Ming with a complicated expression and whispered, "Thank you. Seeking recommendation tickets, to be continued. If you like this work, please come at Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 10:25. In view of the stability of 2 chapters a day this week, in view of the bet between us regarding my health, in view of the lack of recommendation votes in the past few weeks, brothers, let's give it our all this week. Seeking recommendation votes, seeking monthly votes, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to cast recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 10:26. Once he said those words, the thin man fainted. There was no longer just one black line on his face, but several of them. As they connected with each other, they formed the outline of a ghost's head. That ghost's head looked as if it was smiling. It was branded on the thin man's face, and it was a terrifying sight. Su Ming grabbed the person and shifted. As the beast in space hidden behind him roared, he swiftly left into the distance. Several days later, when the thin man opened his eyes and woke up, he was lying on a continent. It was a gigantic stone slab that floated in the galaxy. There were purplish-black plants growing on it, and there was a rotten stench spreading out from it. Almost at the instant he opened his eyes, a focused glint appeared in his eyes. When he sat up, he lifted his right hand, and a freezing light shone. Immediately, a new bone blade appeared in his right hand. With a wary expression, he swept his gaze around and immediately saw Su Ming, who was sitting on a big stone not too far away and had his head lifted while looking at the sky. He was dressed in a long robe made of sackcloth. His hair was a mess, and his skin was slightly dark. A primitive and ancient presence surrounded him and refused to disappear. Even though he looked very young, the vicissitudes of life and the accumulation of time on his body could be seen from his expression and gaze. A complicated look flashed in the thin man's eyes. He looked at Su Ming and did not speak. "You're awake," Su Ming said calmly. He did not look at the man, but continued looking at the sky without any stars, and at the unfamiliar distance. The thin man hesitated for a moment before he whispered to Su Ming, "Just who are you? I've already gotten rid of the poison in your body, but I can't help you recover from the injuries you've suffered over the years," Su Ming said calmly, not answering the man's question. At the moment the thin man woke up, he noticed that the poison in his body had disappeared. When he heard Su Ming's words, he fell silent. "What's your name?" Su Ming asked faintly. "Digio Mo Sha." The thin man was silent for a moment before he told Su Ming his name. "Digio," Su Ming mumbled. He averted his gaze from the sky and turned his head to look at Digio Mo Sha. "Is your tribe called the Ninth Summit?" Su Ming might have looked calm, but only he knew that when he mentioned the Ninth Summit, he had awakened a beautiful memory that had been buried in his heart for a long time. Digio Mo Sha was momentarily stunned. He stared at Su Ming and did not speak. Even if he did not answer, Su Ming had already found his answer. "Is the patriarch of your tribe Tian Xiezi?" Su Ming spoke once again. His voice was calm, but there was an awe-inspiring tone to it, one that said he had to answer the question no matter what. "No." Digio Mo Sha lowered his head and spoke. "I'm not." Su Ming stared at the thin man before him. This person was a member of the tribe his master had formed in Divine Essence Star Ocean. This was something he was certain of. "If that's not the case, then you can leave." Su Ming shook his head and looked at the sky again. He stared at the unfamiliar distance, and a dejected air appeared around him. Digio Mo Sha was stunned. He did not expect that this existence, who he thought was extremely powerful and could fight against the Beast of Void, would not only cure his poison after saving him, but also let him leave after only asking a few questions. A glint appeared in his eyes. Once he stood up slowly, he hesitated for a moment before he wrapped his fist in his palm and bowed towards Su Ming. Then he retreated swiftly and left into the distance in an instant. However, when he was about several thousands of feet away, he came to a halt and looked at Su Ming again. I know that you must have placed some sort of seal on my body that allows you to know my location and follow me from a distance. With that, you can grasp my direction. I can bring you to my tribe, but you must promise me in the name of the god of your tribe that once I bring you back to my tribe, you must release the seal on my body. All right. Su Ming turned around and looked at the thin man before he nodded. The galaxy was boundless and vast. As Su Ming moved deeper into Divine Essence Star Ocean, he saw more floating objects. It did not matter whether it was shattered stones or dust. They would usually move in groups, causing people to be unable to help but think that this place had once been glorious. It was especially so when Su Ming saw a strangely shaped stone flying into the distance like a shooting star. That stone was the head of a statue, and it was covered in cracks. It was 100,000 feet big, and all those who saw it could not help but feel their hearts tremble. That's God Luo Mo's head. It floats in Divine Essence Star Ocean and represents good luck. All those who see it can obtain God Luo Mo's blessing if they worship it, Djo Mo Sha said in a low voice. Djo Mo Sha said softly. His body stopped in the galaxy, and he bowed and worshipped the portrait in the distance. There are 9 God Luo Mo's heads in the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean. They were worshipped by the legendary Luo Mo temple a long time ago, but it's a pity that during the Great Destruction, they crumbled because Luo Mo temple shattered. Su Ming watched the head leave into the distance. When he could no longer see it, he spoke calmly. How much further? Djo Mo Sha cast Su Ming a glance and said softly, once we pass through this star ocean, climb over a star mountain, and walk through a dust-shattered desert, we will see my tribe. Don't worry, the people in the tribes of Divine Essence Star Ocean will not be as cunning as the cultivators in the outside world. They will agree to your request on the surface, but will set up traps in secret. Since I promised to bring you to my tribe, I will definitely not harbor any other thoughts. I also believe that you, who is not rejected by Divine Essence Star Ocean, will also abide by the rules here. Also, the path I'm taking you through might seem slightly far, but it's the safest. We'll avoid a few primitive tribes, and we'll also avoid a few habitats of ferocious beasts. Djo Mo Sha moved forward and turned into a long arc that charged into the distance. Days passed. Half a month later, Su Ming had stayed in the periphery of Divine Essence Star Ocean for several months. On this day, a mountain appeared before them in the galaxy. This was the first time Su Ming saw a mountain in the galaxy. That mountain seemed to be endlessly tall. Su Ming could not see its end, and neither could he see its edges. It was like a gigantic wall that stood erect in the galaxy. This was a mountain formed by an endless amount of broken planets. When Su Ming cast his gaze over it, he found that there were tens of thousands of them. Most of them might be broken, but it was easy to imagine just how shocking the mountain formed by them would be. Su Ming stared at the mountain of stars. During that instant, his eyes seemed to have become still. What sort of divine ability is this? How could it turn so many broken cultivation planets into such a shocking mountain? Su Ming mumbled. No one knows what sort of divine ability it is, and neither does anyone know who created this mountain. However, there is a legend in Divine Essence Star Ocean. Djo Mo Sha cast a glance at Su Ming. Then his gaze landed on the mountain of stars in the distance. It is said that this mountain is a tomb, and a man is buried within it. His wife gave up a small part of Divine Essence Star Ocean to build this tomb for her lover. Those planets were destroyed by his wife. It is said that this man's wife was a powerful existence who came from outer space during the Great Destruction. She created this mountain and turned into a stone to stay by her lover's side, accompanying him from then on. This mountain is also known as Husband Gazing Mountain, Djo Mo Sha said softly. Djo Shah said softly and took the lead in charging towards the mountain. Su Ming looked at the vast mountain of stars, and Djo Shah's words echoed in his ears. In silence, he also walked towards a mountain of stars. It might have seemed close, but in truth, it was still very far away. The two of them used 3 days to truly arrive at the foot of the mountain of stars. They used half a month to reach the mountainside from the foot of the mountain. They did not try to walk to the top of the mountain. Instead, they circled around the mountainside. No one has ever gone to the top of the mountain. At the very least, as far as I can remember, no one has ever managed to do this. It's as if there's a power restricting us, preventing us from reaching the summit. There are also people who say that the woman's stone form is at the summit, and it is also the place where her husband's corpse lies. As long as we don't destroy the mountain rocks and don't force our way to the summit, we won't be in any danger. But if anyone dares to touch even a single part of this place and try to go to the summit again and again, then no one will be able to leave, Djo Shah said solemnly after turning his head around to look at Su Ming. Su Ming stood on a damaged, slanted piece of land. He lifted his head and looked in the direction of the summit. That place was blurry, and he could not see the end of it. However, he did not know whether it was just a figment of his imagination, but he felt as if he could vaguely see a woman standing at the summit. She held a sun made of bone in her hand, and she was playing a mournful song. "Did you hear that?" Su Ming suddenly asked. Djo Shah was momentarily stunned. He listened carefully for some time before he looked at Su Ming in puzzlement. "It's the sound of song." Su Ming closed his eyes. The mournful song of the sun echoed in his ears, stirring up ripples in his heart and stirring up the similar grief in his memories. "I didn't hear it. Let's hurry up and leave." Djo Shah shook his head and quickly moved forward. Su Ming opened his eyes and looked at the blurry mountain before he left into the distance. However, at that moment, he did not see the abyss dragon and the bald crane following behind him. The abyss dragon's expression remained the same, but the bald crane had a dazed look on its face. It lifted its head and stared at the summit, and in its eyes there were tears falling down its cheeks. "Darn it all, what's wrong with me? Why am I crying? Why do I feel so horrible? I want to cry. Damn it, this feeling is too horrible. I want to cry. I feel horrible. I feel like I'm about to die." The bald crane mumbled, and more tears fell down its cheeks. It followed behind the abyss dragon and Su Ming in a daze. Its tears continued falling down its cheeks, but since it was a soul, its tears only lasted for an instant before disappearing on its own. They did not fall on the ground, and neither did they fall on the mountain. They only fell on its heart and pierced through it until it was riddled with holes, but no one could see them. Its consciousness was slightly muddled. It heard the sorrowful song of the sun, and a picture seemed to have appeared in its head. In that picture, it was a crane that was as tall as the universe, and there was a woman sitting on it. That woman was stroking its head and whispering softly to it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.